The sun dipped low over the small town of Fairview, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. Inside Betty's diner, a local favorite with red leather booths and the smell of fresh coffee, Joe Carter sat at his usual corner table. At 98 years old, he was a regular here, quietly sipping his black coffee and savoring a slice of Betty's famous apple pie. His wrinkled hands, adorned with a few faded scars, rested on the table as he gazed out the window. Joe's presence was a staple in the diner, a silent reminder of resilience. Most of the townsfolk knew him as the kindly old man who always tipped generously and wore his World War II veteran cap with pride. Today, however, that tranquility was about to be shattered. The bell above the diner door jingled, drawing everyone's attention. A group of leather-clad bikers swaggered in, their boots heavy against the tiled floor. Their laughter was loud, their demeanor abrasive. They carried an air of dominance that immediately shifted the energy in the room. Joe barely glanced at them, focusing instead on his pie. He had seen men like this before. Not here, not now, but long ago, in another life. He was too old to be rattled by bluster, or so he thought. One of the bikers, a towering man with a scruffy beard and a leather jacket emblazoned with the words Iron Vultures, locked eyes on Joe. His smirk widened as he nudged his companions. "Hey, Pops," the man called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "That's a nice hat you got there. Bet it's older than all of us combined." The other bikers erupted in laughter. A few of the other diners exchanged nervous glances, but no one said a word. Joe didn't respond. He carefully wiped his mouth with a napkin, took a sip of coffee, and set the mug down. "Ah, come on, don't ignore me," the man pressed, stepping closer to Joe's table. "What's a guy like you still doing out here? Shouldn't you be home knitting or something?" Another round of laughter. Joe looked up this time, his piercing blue eyes steady and unflinching. "I don't knit," he said simply, his voice gravelly but calm. The biker leaned over, placing both hands on the table, invading Joe's space. "Oh, you got jokes, huh? Tell me, old man, how many push-ups can you do? Bet you can't even stand up without a walker." Joe held the man's gaze, his expression unreadable. "Why don't you try me and find out?" The tension in the room thickened. Betty, the diner's owner, hesitated behind the counter, clutching a coffee pot, her face pale. One of the other bikers kicked Joe's chair, not hard enough to topple it, but enough to make a point. "Don't," Betty pleaded softly. The leader of the bikers sneered at her. "Relax, lady. We're just having a little fun." Joe adjusted his hat and straightened his posture. "Fun, huh?" He let the word hang in the air. "I've seen your kind before. Bullies always think they're bigger than they are." The biker's grin faded. He stood upright, his hand curling into a fist. "You got a big mouth for a little old man." Joe's hand drifted toward his pocket, and for a moment, it seemed like he might pull something out. The biker flinched, but Joe only retrieved a handkerchief to wipe his brow. "Here's a lesson for you," Joe said, his voice steady. "The loudest dogs bark because they're scared." Before the biker could respond, another voice broke the tension. "That's enough." A man at a nearby booth stood up. He was broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face. He looked like someone who had seen his share of battles. "You heard him," the man said firmly. "Leave the old man alone." The bikers turned toward the stranger, sizing him up. "And who the hell are you?" The man stepped forward, his eyes hard. "Someone who doesn't tolerate cowards picking on veterans. Now get out of here before you embarrass yourselves further." For a moment, it seemed like the bikers might escalate the situation. But something in the man's tone, or maybe the steel in his eyes, gave them pause. With a dismissive grunt, the leader motioned for his crew to back off. "Whatever," he muttered. "This place is a dump anyway." As they left, the tension slowly eased. The man turned to Joe, who nodded in quiet thanks. "Bill Turner," the man said, extending his hand. "Joe Carter," Joe replied, shaking it firmly. "Pleasure to meet you, Joe. Looks like you've got some fight left in you after all." Joe smirked faintly, enough to deal with a few punks. But as the bikers' motorcycles roared to life outside, Joe's expression darkened. This wasn't over. Not yet. What would you do if you saw injustice like this? Would you speak up? Share your thoughts below. The bikers' roaring engines faded into the distance, leaving the diner in uneasy silence. Joe sat back down, but the usual comfort of his booth felt distant. He nodded politely as Betty approached with a fresh slice of pie on the house, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it before him. "Thanks, Betty," Joe said, his gravelly voice softening. "You sure you're okay, Joe?" she asked. Her concerned eyes darted toward the window, as if expecting the bikers to storm back in at any moment. Joe nodded. "Takes more than loud mouths to shake me." Betty hesitated, then patted his shoulder. "If they come back, we'll handle it. You're not alone." As she walked away, Joe poked at the pie with his fork but didn't take a bite. His gaze drifted out the window, his reflection staring back at him. He saw not the old man with white hair and weathered features, but the young soldier he had been decades ago, a man who had faced death more times than he cared to count. Bill Turner slid into the seat across from him, breaking Joe's reverie. "Mind if I join you?" Joe gestured to the seat. "You already did." Bill chuckled lightly. "Fair enough. You handled that better than most would, Joe. But something tells me this wasn't your first encounter with their type." Joe sighed, setting his fork down. "Bullies are the same, whether they're wearing leather jackets or a uniform. They test your limits, see if you'll flinch. The trick is not to." Bill nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "You a veteran?" Joe adjusted his cap, the faded insignia of his old division catching the light. 98th Infantry. World War II. Bill's expression shifted, respect mingling with curiosity. "Well, I'll be. My old man was with the 101st Airborne. I served in Vietnam myself. Marine Corps." Joe studied him for a moment. "Figures. You carry yourself like a soldier." A grin tugged at Bill's lips. "Old habits die hard." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Those bikers. They'll be back, Joe. Guys like that don't take kindly to being embarrassed." Joe met Bill's gaze, his expression unreadable. "Let them come." Bill frowned. "You don't have to prove anything. Guys like us, we've already fought our battles. No need to take on more, especially at your age." Joe leaned back, his fingers lightly drumming the edge of the table. "It's not about proving anything, Bill. It's about standing your ground. I didn't survive Normandy just to cower now." The name hit Bill like a punch to the chest. "Normandy," he echoed, his tone soft. Joe nodded. "Lost a lot of good men there. Best friends I ever had. They didn't get to live to see their 90s. Sometimes I wonder why I did." For a moment, the two men sat in silence, the weight of their shared experiences filling the space between them. "You ever talk about it?" Bill asked carefully. Joe's eyes narrowed. "Not much to talk about. War is messy. People die. You do what you have to, and you live with it. Or you don't." Bill seemed to wrestle with his next words before finally saying, "My old man couldn't talk about it either. It ate him up inside. Cost him his family in the end." Joe's jaw tightened. "We all deal with it in our own way. Me? I just keep moving forward." Bill nodded, but there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes. "Moving forward's easier when you're not alone." Joe didn't reply. Instead, he glanced out the window again, the fading daylight casting long shadows over the parking lot. He didn't want to admit it, but Bill's words struck a nerve. Later that evening, Joe walked home through the quiet streets of Fairview. The air was cool, and the faint chirping of crickets accompanied his steady steps. His modest house sat at the edge of town, a small, weathered structure that stood as a testament to simpler times. Inside, the walls were adorned with framed photos. A younger Joe in uniform, his late wife smiling beside him, and a black and white picture of a young boy holding a fishing rod. Joe's steps slowed as he passed that photo, his fingers lightly grazing the glass. "Tommy," he murmured, his voice barely audible. The house was quiet now, too quiet. Joe shuffled into the living room and sank into his favorite armchair, the leather worn smooth from decades of use. His gaze lingered on the old rotary phone sitting on the side table. He picked it up, his fingers hovering over the dial. Memories flooded back. Voices, faces, moments both triumphant and tragic. He shook his head and set the phone back down. The past was better left buried. But as Joe sat in the silence, a distant sound reached his ears, the low rumble of motorcycle engines in the distance. It grew louder, closer. Joe's hand instinctively reached for the side table drawer. Inside, nestled among old papers and trinkets, lay a small pistol. His fingers brushed against it before pulling back. "Not yet," he muttered to himself. The engines roared past his house without stopping, fading into the night. But Joe knew they'd be back. He leaned forward, his eyes hardening. "This isn't over," he said aloud. "What would you do if your peace was threatened like this? Would you fight back or turn the other cheek? Let us know below." Morning light streamed through the curtains of Joe's living room as he stirred awake in his armchair. He had dozed off after a restless night, his thoughts tangled with old memories and the lingering unease of the biker's taunts. He rubbed his eyes and stood, his joints protesting as he moved to the kitchen to brew his morning coffee. The faint aroma filled the house, grounding him in the present, but his mind refused to settle. The rumble of motorcycles from the night before echoed in his ears. As Joe poured his coffee, a knock at the door startled him. He set the mug down carefully, his hand instinctively reaching for the drawer where the pistol lay. With deliberate steps, he approached the door, peering through the peephole. It was Bill Turner. Joe opened the door, his expression neutral. "Morning, Bill. You always drop by uninvited?" Bill grinned. "Only when I'm worried about someone." Joe stepped aside to let him in. "Coffee?" "Never say no to a good cup," Bill replied, stepping into the cozy, cluttered space. Joe handed him a mug and gestured toward the kitchen table. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the clink of Bill's spoon against the ceramic the only sound. "Busy night?" Bill asked, finally breaking the silence. Joe's brow furrowed. "You could say that. Heard those bikers cruising past. Didn't stop, though." Bill nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "For now, guys like that don't let things go easily." Joe leaned back in his chair, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Bill's. "You're here because you think I need help. That it?" Bill hesitated, then nodded. "You're sharp, Joe, and I know you're tough. But let's face it, you're not 25 anymore. You don't need to fight this alone." Joe's lips pressed into a thin line. "Fought my way through worse." "I don't doubt that," Bill said. "But this isn't war. You've got people here who care. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." Joe stared into his coffee, the swirling liquid reflecting his weathered face. "It's not about proving something. It's about respect. Those men think they can push people around, take what they want. Someone's got to stand up to them." Bill leaned forward, his tone firm but not unkind. "Standing up doesn't mean putting yourself in harm's way. We can go to the sheriff, report what happened." Joe snorted. "Sheriff's understaffed and overworked. What's he gonna do? File a report and hope they play nice?" Bill opened his mouth to argue, but the look on Joe's face stopped him. This wasn't just about the bikers. It ran deeper, tied to something Joe wasn't ready to share. "You're stubborn. You know that?" Bill said with a half-smile. "Pot calling the kettle black," Joe shot back, a faint grin tugging at his lips. The moment of levity was short-lived. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Joe froze, his hand instinctively moving toward the drawer again. Bill stood, motioning for Joe to stay put. He opened the door cautiously, revealing a young woman in her early 20s. She had a determined look in her eyes and held a notebook clutched tightly against her chest. "Can I help you?" Bill asked. "I'm looking for Joseph Carter," she said, her voice steady but polite. Joe stepped forward, his expression curious but guarded. "I'm Joe Carter. Who's asking?" The woman extended her hand. "I'm Emily Harper. I'm a journalist with the Fairview Gazette. I heard about the incident at the diner yesterday, and I'd like to talk to you about it." Joe's jaw tightened. "What business is it of yours?" Emily hesitated. "With all due respect, Mr. Carter, you're a local hero. People know about your service, your story. And now this, standing up to those bikers. It's inspiring. The town deserves to know." Bill glanced at Joe, gauging his reaction. Joe shook his head. "There's nothing heroic about sitting in a diner minding your own business. But there is something heroic about refusing to back down," Emily pressed. The town could use a story like this, something to remind people to stand up for what's right. Joe turned away, his hand tightening into a fist at his side. I'm not interested in being a story. Emily frowned but didn't push further. If you change your mind, here's my card. She set it on the table near the door. And, Mr. Carter, thank you for your service. With that, she left, the door clicking shut behind her. Bill crossed his arms. She's right, you know. People need to see someone standing up to those bullies. Might even make them think twice before trying something again. Joe sighed heavily. I didn't stand up for the town. I stood up because they got in my face. Maybe so, Bill said. But sometimes, doing the right thing for yourself ends up helping others, whether you mean to or not. Joe didn't respond, but the weight of Bill's words lingered. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Joe sat on his porch, the journalist's card still in his hand. He turned it over a few times before slipping it into his pocket. The distant sound of motorcycles cut through the quiet once more, sending a chill up his spine. This time, they stopped. Joe's eyes narrowed as headlights illuminated his driveway. A group of bikers dismounted, their silhouettes casting long shadows across the yard. Joe stood, his hands steady as he reached for the rotary phone inside the door. I warned you, he muttered under his breath. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years, the motion's automatic. When the line connected, a familiar voice answered. Joe Carter? It's been a long time. Joe's lips curved into a faint, determined smile. Not long enough. I need a favor. What would you do if danger came knocking at your door? Would you call for help or face it alone? Let us know your thoughts below. The phone clicked as the voice on the other end responded, calm but curious. Didn't think I'd hear from you again, Joe, the man said, his tone gruff yet laced with familiarity. What kind of troubles got you calling me after all these years? Joe glanced toward the yard, where the bikers milled about near their motorcycles, their voices low and threatening. He leaned against the doorframe, keeping his eyes on them. Local gang, Joe replied curtly. Harassing folks, trying to intimidate. Now they're on my doorstep. I don't plan to let it slide. A dry chuckle came through the line. Still the same Joe Carter, always ready to fight the good fight. I didn't call for a lecture, Pete, Joe snapped, though there was no real anger in his voice. You still have connections or not? There was a pause, followed by a sigh. I do. You sure you want me to pull those strings? It could stir up more than you're ready for. Joe's grip on the phone tightened. I'm sure. Pete's tone shifted, more serious now. All right, I'll make a few calls. But, Joe, be careful. This isn't the battlefield anymore. Things get messy in different ways. They've been messy my whole life, Joe said before hanging up. Joe returned to the porch, his movements slow but deliberate. The bikers had noticed him now, their conversation halting as one of them. The leader from the diner stepped forward. Hey, old man, the leader called, his voice dripping with mockery. You thought about our little talk yesterday? Figured we'd drop by and see if you've changed your mind. Joe crossed his arms, his expression cold. The answer's still no. The leader grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. You've got guts, I'll give you that. Shame it's wasted on someone who doesn't know when to quit. The others chuckled, the sound low and menacing. Joe took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. I've seen men like you before. You push people around because it makes you feel big. But I've got news for you. You're not as big as you think. The leader's grin faltered, replaced by a scowl. He took a threatening step toward Joe. You're asking for trouble, old man. Before the tension could escalate further, headlights washed over the scene. A black SUV pulled into Joe's driveway, the vehicle's size and dark windows exuding authority. The bikers turned, squinting against the light as the engine cut off and two men stepped out. They were dressed in plain clothes, but their demeanor screamed military precision. Joe Carter? One of them called, his voice calm but firm. Joe nodded. That's me. The man approached, extending a hand. Pete sent us. Said you might need a hand. Joe shook his hand, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Good timing. The leader of the bikers scoffed, his bravado returning. Who are these guys? Your babysitters? The man from the SUV turned to face him, his expression hard as stone. "We're the people who end problems like yours." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence wavering. Joe stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. "This is your last chance. Walk away and don't come back. If you don't, you'll wish you had." The leader hesitated, his bravado battling with the clear threat standing before him. Finally, he sneered. "You're not worth the trouble." He turned to his crew. "Let's go." The bikers mounted their motorcycles and roared away into the night, their taillights disappearing into the darkness. Joe exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Thanks for showing up," he said to the men. The leader of the pair nodded. "Anytime. Pete said to let you know he's got your back, whatever you need." Joe gave a small nod. "Tell him I appreciate it." As the SUV pulled away, Joe stood on his porch, watching the night return to silence. He knew this wasn't over. The bikers had been humiliated, and men like them didn't let go of grudges easily. He turned and went back inside, locking the door behind him. His mind was already working, thinking several steps ahead. He wasn't going to wait for them to make the next move. The next morning, Joe was back at the diner, his usual booth waiting for him. The regulars greeted him with nods and smiles, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. News of the bikers' visit had spread, and everyone was on edge. Betty approached with a fresh cup of coffee. "You okay, Joe?" Joe nodded. "I'm fine, Betty." She hesitated, then leaned closer. "We're all worried. Those men, they're dangerous." Joe met her gaze, his expression calm but firm. "They only win if we let them, and I'm not about to let them." Betty straightened, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. "Well, if anyone can stand up to them, it's you." As Joe sipped his coffee, Emily Harper walked in, her notebook in hand. She spotted Joe and made her way to his booth. "Mr. Carter," she began, her tone professional yet curious. "Do you have a moment?" Joe raised an eyebrow. "Didn't I tell you I'm not interested in being a story?" "You did," Emily admitted, taking a seat across from him. "But I think there's more to this than just yesterday's incident. People need to hear about courage like yours, especially now." Joe sighed, setting his mug down. "Courage isn't about making headlines, Miss Harper. It's about doing what's right, no matter who's watching." "Exactly," Emily said, her eyes lighting up. "And that's why your story matters." Joe studied her for a moment, then shook his head with a faint chuckle. "You're persistent. I'll give you that." "It's my job," Emily replied, smiling. Joe leaned back in his seat, considering her words. He had spent his life avoiding the spotlight, but maybe, just maybe, sharing his story could make a difference. "Fine," he said at last, "but I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it for the town." Emily nodded, her pen poised over her notebook. "Let's start from the beginning. What would you do to protect your community? How far would you go to stand up for what's right? Let us know your thoughts below." Joe sat across from Emily in the booth, his hands cradling his coffee mug. The clink of plates and hum of conversations in the diner faded into the background as she asked her first question. "Let's start with your service, Mr. Carter. People in town know you're a veteran, but they don't know much else. Where did it all begin?" Joe looked out the window, his gaze distant. "I enlisted in 1944, right after my 18th birthday. They sent me to Europe, to the front lines. I was just a kid, thought I'd be back home in a few months. Didn't realize I'd come back a different man." Emily's pen moved swiftly across the page. "What did you do in the war?" "Infantry," Joe replied. "Our unit was in the thick of it. Normandy, the Ardennes, even a little place called Bastogne. We fought, bled, and buried too many good men. By the end, I wasn't just fighting for my country. I was fighting to survive." His voice was steady, but there was a heaviness to his words that hung in the air. "What kept you going?" Emily asked gently. Joe paused, his fingers tightening on the mug. "The guys beside me. When you're in the trenches, it's not about politics or strategy. It's about the man next to you. You fight for them, and they fight for you." Emily nodded, her eyes scanning his face for the untold story beneath. "And when the war ended?" Joe sighed. "I came back here. The world had moved on, but I hadn't. Found work where I could, kept my head down. figured I'd done my part, and the rest didn't matter. Emily tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her expression. But you didn't really leave the fight behind, did you? Joe's lips pressed into a thin line. The fight never leaves you, Miss Harper. It just changes. The sound of the diner door opening drew their attention. Bill Turner walked in, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Joe and Emily. He approached, his expression cautious. "Hope I'm not interrupting," Bill said. "Not at all," Emily replied. "We were just talking about Joe's service." Bill slid into the booth beside Joe, his tone quiet but urgent. "You might want to wrap this up. Word on the street is those bikers didn't take last night too well. They're talking about coming back in force." Joe's jaw tightened. "Let them come." "Joe," Bill began, but Emily cut in. "What do they want from you?" she asked. "Control," Joe said simply. "They want everyone to be too scared to stand up to them. It's not just me. They're trying to take over the whole town." Emily leaned forward. "So what's the plan? How do you fight back?" Joe exchanged a glance with Bill, then looked back at her. "I don't think you understand, Miss Harper. This isn't just my fight. It's the town's fight. And the only way we win is if we stand together." Later that afternoon, Joe and Bill walked through Main Street, stopping at the hardware store, the bakery, and even the local library. Everywhere they went, Joe talked to the townsfolk, his quiet but firm words inspiring a sense of unity and purpose. "We can't let them intimidate us," Joe said to a small group gathered outside the grocery store. "They thrive on fear. But if we stand together, we can show them this town isn't theirs to take." His words spread like wildfire. By evening, a meeting was called at the town hall. The hall buzzed with chatter as townspeople filled the seats, their faces a mix of worry and determination. Joe stood at the front, Bill by his side. Emily sat near the back, her notebook open, recording every detail. Joe cleared his throat, and the room quieted. "I know you're scared," he began. "I'm scared too. But fear is what they want. They think they can break us by pushing us around, making us doubt ourselves and each other." He looked out at the crowd, his voice growing stronger. "But we're stronger than that. This town has faced hard times before, and we've always come through. Together. That's how we beat them, by showing them we're not just individuals, but a community that looks out for each other." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. "What do we do, Joe?" someone called out. "We organize," Joe said firmly. "We keep an eye out for each other. We document everything, pictures, videos, witnesses. If they step out of line, we make sure they face the law. And we don't give them an inch of what they want." Bill stepped forward. "We've got folks willing to patrol the streets, keep watch at night. But it'll take all of us to make this work." The room buzzed with renewed energy. People began volunteering, sharing ideas, and forming plans. Emily watched it all unfold, a sense of awe washing over her. Joe Carter wasn't just a man standing up to bullies. He was rallying a town, showing them the power of unity. As the meeting wrapped up, Emily approached Joe. "You're not just a veteran," she said. "You're a leader." Joe shook his head. "I'm just an old soldier who's seen what happens when good people do nothing. I'm not letting that happen here." Emily smiled. "That's exactly why your story needs to be told." Joe looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "You tell it then, but make sure you get it right. This isn't about me, it's about all of us. How would you rally your community in the face of a threat? Share your thoughts and ideas below." The next morning, the sun rose over the small town, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the tension in the air. Joe stood on his porch, his coffee steaming in the crisp morning air. Despite the meeting's success the previous night, he knew the battle was far from over. The roar of motorcycles broke the silence. Joe watched as a small group of bikers passed by his street, their pace slow and deliberate. They didn't stop, but the message was clear. "We're watching." Joe's grip tightened on his coffee mug, but he stayed rooted in place, staring them down until they disappeared around the corner. Inside, he picked up the phone and called Bill. "They're circling again," Joe said without preamble. "We've got folks patrolling," Bill replied. "I'll send someone your way, just in case." Joe nodded, though Bill couldn't see it. "Good. Keep everyone alert. They're testing us." The diner buzzed with conversation as Joe walked in a few hours later. Betty had a plate of pancakes ready before he even sat down. "Morning, Joe," she said with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Heard about the meeting. Folks are saying you lit a fire under this town." "About time someone did," Joe replied, sitting at his usual booth. Emily Harper was there, as expected, her notebook and pen ready. She slid into the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "I was hoping to catch you," she began. "There's a lot of buzz around town about last night. People are inspired, but they're also scared. What's next?" Joe looked at her, his expression steady. "Next, we prepare. Fear's natural, but action overcomes it. The more we work together, the less room we leave for those bikers to operate." Emily scribbled down his words, her eyes bright with curiosity. "And what about you? You've become the face of this movement. Are you ready for that?" Joe smirked faintly. "I'm ready for whatever comes. Always have been." As the day wore on, signs of the town's unity became more apparent. Small groups of townsfolk patrolled the streets, armed with flashlights and radios. Shop owners posted signs of solidarity in their windows. This town stands together. But not everyone was convinced. That afternoon, Joe visited the hardware store to pick up supplies. He found himself face-to-face with Sam Johnson, one of the town's older residents. Sam crossed his arms as Joe approached. "Joe," Sam said, his tone skeptical, "I heard about your little speech last night. Stirring up trouble is what you're doing." Joe met his gaze evenly. "Stirring up trouble? Sam, those bikers have been pushing this town around for months. How much longer were you planning to look the other way?" Sam frowned, his jaw tightening. "It's not about looking the other way. It's about keeping the peace." "There is no peace," Joe said firmly. "Not when people are too scared to leave their homes, to run their businesses. If we don't stand up now, there won't be a town left to keep the peace in." Sam hesitated, then sighed, his shoulders slumping. "You're a stubborn man, Joe Carter." "And you're a good man, Sam," Joe replied. "Join us. We need every hand we can get." Sam grumbled something under his breath but nodded. All right. I'll see what I can do." As evening fell, the town square was quiet, but the tension lingered in the air like a storm cloud. Joe walked the streets, checking in with patrols and speaking to the occasional passerby. It was just past midnight when the sound of motorcycles shattered the calm. A group of bikers roared into the square, their engines revving loudly, echoing off the buildings. Joe stepped out from the shadows, his posture straight and unflinching. The bikers noticed him immediately, their leader pulling his bike to a stop a few feet away. Well, the leader drawled, dismounting. "If it isn't the town hero." Joe crossed his arms. "What do you want?" The leader smirked. "What we've always wanted. Respect. Cooperation. You're making this a lot harder than it needs to be, old man." "Respect isn't earned by threats and bullying," Joe shot back. The leader's smirk faded, replaced by a sneer. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts only get you so far." Behind him, the other bikers shifted, their movements deliberate and menacing. Joe didn't flinch. "This town stands together. You can try to break us, but you'll fail." The leader chuckled darkly. "We'll see about that." Without another word, he climbed back onto his bike, and the gang roared out of the square, their laughter echoing in the night. Joe watched them go, his jaw set. The storm was coming, but he was ready. How do you handle a confrontation with bullies? Would you stand your ground or try another approach? Share your thoughts below. The morning came with news that shook the town. At the hardware store, Sam Johnson stood outside, hands on his hips, staring at the shattered glass of his front window. Spray painted across the wall were the words, "Stay out of it." A crowd began to gather, their murmurs filling the crisp air. Joe arrived minutes later, his expression grim as he surveyed the damage. "This is their way of sending a message," Sam muttered, his voice low. "They think they can scare us into silence." Joe placed a hand on his shoulder. "The question is, are you scared?" Sam looked at him, his jaw tightening. "No, just angry." "Good," Joe said. "Anger can be useful if you channel it right. We'll clean this up, and we'll show them we're not backing down." By midday, the hardware store was as good as new, thanks to the swift work of volunteers. A new sign was posted on the front window. "We stand united." Emily Harper showed up with her camera, snapping photos of the repairs and interviewing townsfolk. "They're trying to intimidate us," she said to Joe as they stood on the sidewalk. "But it looks like the town is rallying instead." Joe nodded. "That's the idea. They want to divide us, but every act of theirs just brings us closer together." The bikers didn't take kindly to the town's resilience. That night, they returned, this time targeting multiple locations. The bakery's sign was smashed, graffiti marred the library's walls, and the lights on Main Street were shattered. Joe and Bill were on patrol when they discovered the damage. Bill let out a low whistle as they stood outside the bakery. "They're escalating," Bill said. Joe's jaw tightened. "So will we." The next day, the town held another meeting, this time in the park. The air was electric with a mix of fear and determination. Joe stood in front of the crowd, his voice strong and steady. "Last night, they tried to scare us again. But look around. We're all still here. They're underestimating us. They think we'll fold. But we won't." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "We're stepping up our patrols," Bill added. "And we've got cameras going up around Main Street. Every move they make will be recorded." Emily stood, her notebook in hand. "I've also contacted some reporters outside of town. If the bikers want attention, we'll give it to them, the kind they don't want." Joe looked at her, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Good. The more eyes on this, the better." As the meeting ended, Joe found himself approached by a young man in his 20s. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice hesitant. "My name's Mike. I've been wanting to talk to you." Joe studied him, noting the nervous energy in his posture. "What's on your mind, Mike?" Mike glanced around before lowering his voice. "I used to ride with them, with the bikers. Left a few months back. I didn't agree with where things were heading." Joe's eyebrows rose. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want to help," Mike said earnestly. "I know how they think, what they're planning. If you'll trust me, I can give you information." Joe considered him for a moment before nodding. "Come by my place later. We'll talk." That evening, Joe sat on his porch, waiting for Mike. When the young man arrived, he was carrying a small duffel bag. "What's in the bag?" Joe asked. Mike set it down, unzipping it to reveal folders, photographs, and notebooks. "Proof," he said simply. "Records of their activities, who's in charge, what they've been doing, where they're planning to strike next." Joe's eyes narrowed as he sifted through the contents. "Why do you have this?" "I knew I'd need it someday," Mike replied. "They're not just bullies, they're criminals. And if you're serious about stopping them, you're going to need more than just cameras and patrols." Joe nodded slowly. "This is a good start. But if we're going to use this, we'll need to do it right." The next morning, Joe met with Bill and Emily at the diner, spreading the evidence across their booth table. "This is big," Emily said, her eyes scanning the photos and documents. "If this gets out, it could bring them down." "That's the idea," Joe said. "But we need to be careful. If they find out we have this, they'll come after us harder than ever." Bill nodded. "Then we move quietly. We get this to the right people, law enforcement, media. Let them do the heavy lifting while we keep the town protected." Joe looked at Emily. "You up for helping with that?" Emily's eyes gleamed with determination. "Absolutely." As they left the diner, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was just beginning. The bikers were dangerous, but with the town united and the truth on their side, he believed they had a chance. If you had proof of someone's wrongdoing, how would you handle it? Would you go public or work behind the scenes? Let us know your thoughts. The town buzzed with cautious energy as word of the newfound evidence spread through the inner circle. Joe, Bill, and Emily worked tirelessly, organizing the material Mike had provided while ensuring the patrols remained vigilant. It wasn't long before the bikers noticed something had shifted. That evening, Joe sat with Emily in his living room, stacks of papers and photographs spread out on the coffee table. Mike was there too, pacing the floor as he explained the contents of each folder. "This," Mike said, pointing to a photo of a ledger, "is how they've been funneling stolen goods through out-of-town buyers. They use the warehouse near the highway to store everything before it's shipped out. Emily scribbled notes furiously. And these names, she said, tapping the ledger. Who are they? Buyers, suppliers, and even a few friendly law enforcement contacts, Mike replied grimly. Joe leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. If this is true, we're not just dealing with a gang of thugs. This is organized crime. That's why I left, Mike said, his voice heavy. It wasn't about bikes or brotherhood anymore. It was about power and control. Joe exchanged a glance with Emily. We'll need to act quickly. The longer we sit on this, the greater the risk. The next day, Emily made discreet calls to her contacts in the media and law enforcement. She found an ally in Detective Sarah Blake, a state investigator with a reputation for tackling corruption. This is big, Emily, Detective Blake said over the phone. If the evidence holds up, we can take them down. But I'll need time to coordinate a raid and secure warrants. How much time? Emily asked. A few days, maybe a week, Blake replied. Until then, keep this quiet. If they catch wind of what you're doing, it could get ugly. Meanwhile, Joe focused on keeping the town united and prepared. He knew the bikers wouldn't sit idly by, and sure enough, the next wave of intimidation came swiftly. Late one night, a patrol led by Bill discovered several cars vandalized outside the community center. Windows shattered, tires slashed, and the same ominous graffiti. Stay out of it. The bikers were sending a message. Joe arrived minutes later, his face a mask of calm fury. He addressed the group gathered near the damage. This is exactly what they want, he said, his voice steady. They want us scared and divided. But every time they pull a stunt like this, it proves we're getting to them. Stay strong. Stay together. As the town rallied once more, Mike found himself growing uneasy. He met Joe at the diner the next morning, his hands fidgeting with a cup of coffee. Something's coming, Joe, Mike said, his voice low. They've been too quiet today. That's not like them. Joe studied him, his expression unreadable. You think they're planning something big? Mike nodded. I'd bet on it. And if they suspect we've got the evidence, they won't hold back. Joe's jaw tightened. Then we'll be ready. By evening, Joe had coordinated an emergency meeting with Bill, Emily, and a few key townsfolk. We need to fortify our patrols and double our efforts to watch the warehouse near the highway, Joe said, spreading a map across the table. What about the evidence? Bill asked. If they find it, it's all over. I've already sent copies to Detective Blake, Emily replied. But we'll keep the originals hidden here, just in case. The group dispersed with renewed determination, but an air of tension lingered. The bikers' next move could come at any moment. That night, as Joe sat on his porch, he heard the faint hum of engines in the distance. He stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the baseball bat he kept by the door. The sound grew louder, closer. Moments later, a single biker pulled into view, stopping just outside Joe's fence. The man dismounted, his leather jacket glinting under the porch light. He was tall and broad, his face partially obscured by a helmet. Carter, the man called out, his voice gravelly. Joe didn't respond immediately. He stepped forward, gripping the bat tightly. What do you want? The man removed his helmet, revealing a scarred face and cold eyes. A warning. You in this town are poking your noses where they don't belong. Stop now, or we'll make sure you regret it. Joe held his ground, his eyes never leaving the bikers. Tell your boss we're not backing down. Not now, not ever. The biker smirked, shaking his head. Suit yourself, old man. Don't say I didn't warn you. He climbed back onto his bike and sped off into the night, leaving Joe standing in the eerie quiet. Joe turned back toward the house, his resolve stronger than ever. The fight was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain. This town wouldn't bow to fear. If you were in Joe's shoes, how would you respond to a direct threat? Would you stand firm or try to negotiate? Share your thoughts below. Joe didn't sleep that night. The biker's warning played over and over in his mind, but instead of fear, it fueled his determination. At first light, he called Bill, Emily, and Mike to his house. We're out of time, Joe began, setting a pot of coffee on the table. They know we're not backing down, and that makes them dangerous. They'll escalate, Mike said, his tone grim. They won't stop at threats. Emily nodded. We need to act faster. What's Detective Blake's timeline? I'll push her to move quicker, Emily replied, pulling out her phone. But even if she can't, we have to be ready for whatever comes next. The town mobilized like never before. Patrols doubled, and volunteers worked around the clock to secure homes and businesses. Cameras were installed at key locations, and the community center became the unofficial headquarters for their efforts. Mike spent hours sketching out the layout of the bikers' warehouse, marking exits, storage areas, and potential hiding spots. This is where they keep most of their stolen goods, Mike explained, pointing to a cluster of rooms near the back of the warehouse. If we can get clear footage of what's inside, it'll strengthen the case against them. Joe studied the map, his mind racing. We'll need someone on the inside to get that footage. Someone who knows the layout. Mike hesitated, then nodded. I'll do it. They won't suspect me. I've been out long enough that they probably think I've moved on. No, Joe said firmly. It's too dangerous. It's the best option, Mike countered. If this is going to work, we need solid evidence. I can get it. That evening, Emily received a call from Detective Blake. We're moving up the timeline, Blake said. We've got enough to raid the warehouse, but we need confirmation that the stolen goods are still there. Can your team handle that? Emily's stomach nodded. We'll get it done, she said, glancing at Mike. The next night, Mike slipped into the warehouse under the cover of darkness, a small camera strapped to his chest. Joe, Bill, and Emily waited anxiously in a parked car down the road, their radios crackling softly. I'm in, Mike's voice came through the radio. Be careful, Joe said, gripping the receiver tightly. Inside, Mike moved cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the concrete floor. He passed rows of crates and shelves, his camera capturing every detail. He paused near a stack of boxes marked with unfamiliar symbols. Opening one, he revealed electronics, laptops, phones, and tablets. This is it, Mike whispered. I've got what we need. As he turned to leave, the sound of voices froze him in place. Who's there? A gruff voice called out. Mike ducked behind a crate, his heart pounding. He listened as footsteps grew closer, the beam of a flashlight cutting through the shadows. Stay calm, Joe's voice crackled in his ear. Find cover and wait for an opening. Mike's hands shook as he fumbled for a metal wrench on the floor. When the flashlight beam swept past his hiding spot, he hurled the wrench across the room. The clatter drew the biker's attention, and Mike took the chance to slip out the back door. I'm out, he gasped into the radio as he sprinted toward the waiting car. The relief in Joe's voice was palpable. Good work. Get in, quick. Back at the community center, the team reviewed the footage. It was exactly what they needed. Emily immediately sent the files to Detective Blake, who confirmed that the raid was set for the following night. We're finally making progress, Emily said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Joe nodded, though his expression remained tense. This isn't over yet. They'll fight back hard when they realize what's happening. The bikers, however, were already on the move. Unbeknownst to the town, one of the bikers had spotted Mike leaving the warehouse. By morning, the gang knew someone had infiltrated their operation. At dawn, the sound of roaring engines echoed down Main Street. The bikers arrived en masse, their presence a clear show of force. They parked in front of the community center, their leader, a hulking man named Razor, stepping forward. Joe Carter. Razor bellowed, his voice booming. You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Time to pay the price. Joe emerged from the center, flanked by Bill and Emily. The townsfolk gathered nearby, their fear evident but their resolve unshaken. I'm not afraid of you, Joe said, his voice steady. Razor smirked. You should be. The bikers began circling the town, their intimidation tactics reaching a fever pitch. But instead of scattering, the townsfolk stood their ground, forming a united front. That night, as the bikers regrouped, Joe gathered the town for one final meeting. Tomorrow, the raid happens, Joe announced. We've done everything we can to protect this town and gather the evidence. Now, we hold the line. The room erupted in cheers and applause, the community's spirit stronger than ever. Joe looked out at the crowd, pride swelling in his chest. They had come so far, and no matter what happened next, he knew they wouldn't break. When faced with a direct confrontation, how would you handle the pressure? Stand tall or seek a different approach? Share your perspective below. The tension in the town was palpable the next morning. Every house was on alert, every phone had its ringer turned up loud, and everyone who could lend a hand was ready to help. Joe, Bill, Emily, and Mike stood near the community center, watching the sun rise behind the hills. "They'll be here soon," Emily said, her voice tight with anticipation. Joe nodded, his jaw clenched. He'd never imagined it would come to this, but there was no turning back now. They'd gathered enough evidence to bring down the bikers. Tonight, they would make their move. At precisely 10 a.m., Detective Blake arrived with a team of officers from the state police. Their vehicles were discreet, blending into the quiet streets. Emily and Mike had already briefed them on the layout of the bikers' warehouse. Now, it was time for the final piece of the puzzle. "Ready?" Detective Blake asked, glancing at Joe. Joe nodded. "Let's do it." The team assembled in their cars, and within moments, they were off, speeding toward the warehouse. Behind them, the townspeople gathered in small groups, their eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. They knew the raid could either make or break their efforts. The warehouse loomed ahead, an imposing structure surrounded by tall fences and shadows. Razor and his gang had clearly fortified the place, but they hadn't anticipated the coordinated response of the town and law enforcement. As they approached, the state police vehicle took the lead, with Emily and Joe's group close behind. Bill's truck was parked a little further down the road as a lookout, ready to alert the team in case anything went wrong. Detective Blake signaled, and the officers surged forward, rushing the warehouse with precision. Joe's heart raced as they neared the door. Every second felt like an eternity. Inside the warehouse, the bikers were caught off guard. Razor, his second in command, and a few others were inside, but the rest of the gang was scattered, most of them outside their stronghold. As officers stormed in, chaos erupted. The bikers scrambled, reaching for their weapons, but the police were too fast, taking them down one by one. "Clear!" one officer shouted, signaling the team to push deeper into the warehouse. Joe and Emily followed, their eyes scanning the room. They could see crates full of stolen goods, electronics, and other valuables stacked high. Mike's earlier reconnaissance had been dead on. Upstairs, Razor, realizing his empire was crumbling, made a final stand. With a gun drawn, he and a handful of his toughest men moved toward the back exit. They were desperate to escape the trap they had walked right into. Joe, hearing the commotion, motioned to Bill. "This is it. We can't let them get away." Bill was already moving, his fingers curling tightly around his radio. On it. They sprinted toward the back of the building, aiming to cut off Razor's escape. Just as the bikers reached the exit, Bill and Joe burst into the room, guns drawn. "Stay where you are," Joe barked. Razor stopped, sneering. "You think you've won? This isn't over, old man. You have no idea who you're messing with." Joe's voice was calm, unyielding. "No, Razor. It's over. You're going down." The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like hours. Razor's finger twitched near the trigger of his gun, but before he could make a move, one of the officers entered behind him and tackled him to the ground. "You're under arrest," the officer said, his voice firm. The sound of sirens filled the air as the bikers were rounded up and loaded into police vehicles. The battle for the town was won. The bikers were being taken away, one by one, and their operation was dismantled. Joe stood outside the warehouse, his heart still pounding in his chest. It was done. The bikers were off the streets, and the town was safe, at least for now. Emily stood beside him, smiling. "We did it." Mike, who had stayed behind at the community center to monitor the situation, jogged up to them. "That was too close, but we got them. We really did." Bill joined the group, wiping sweat from his brow. "Hell of a fight, but we held our ground. This town's not gonna let anyone bully us anymore." Joe looked around, his pride swelling. "No, this town won't bend." Later that evening, after the bikers were taken into custody and the streets had cleared, the community gathered again at the center. There was a palpable sense of relief, but also something deeper, a renewed sense of unity. They had fought back against something that had threatened to destroy them, and they had won. We couldn't have done this without all of you, Joe said, addressing the crowd. Every person who stood with us, every single person who said no to fear. We've made this town stronger. The crowd cheered, their spirits lifted. Mike stood beside Joe, his eyes glistening with a rare emotion, pride. You were right, Joe. This is about more than just bikes. It's about standing up for what's right. Joe smiled at him. You've done more than you realize, Mike. We couldn't have done this without you. As the evening came to a close, Joe stepped outside into the cool night air. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly above. He could hear the quiet murmur of the town behind him, a sound that, for the first time in a long while, felt peaceful. He glanced at the distant hills, knowing that while this battle was over, the fight for his town's future was just beginning. The road ahead would be long, but they had shown what they were capable of. They would face whatever came next, together. If you had to fight for your town or community, what would you do to bring people together and ensure their safety? Share your thoughts below. The dust had barely settled when the phone call started. First, it was a local news station asking for an interview. Then came the questions from the state police about the details of the raid. Finally, there were messages from townspeople, all eager to express their gratitude. Joe had expected some form of recognition, but he hadn't realized how deeply the event had affected the community. Everyone from the local shopkeepers to the farmers who lived miles outside town felt like they had a part in this victory. But with the relief came a new kind of pressure. The town was safe, for now, but the reality of what they had just faced started to sink in. Razor and his gang were gone, but there were still people who feared retaliation. The bikers weren't just criminals. They were part of a larger network that Joe knew would want to reassert control sooner or later. Emily, sitting across from Joe in his living room, broke the silence. We've won the battle, but we haven't won the war. The bikers aren't just going to disappear. They'll be back, or worse, someone else will come. Joe looked at her, his expression serious. I know. We need to be ready for anything. She nodded. The community's behind us. That's our greatest strength. But we need a plan. A long-term one. The next few days were filled with meetings. Joe, Emily, Bill, and Mike sat down with the local leaders, law enforcement, and some of the more vocal citizens to discuss the future. We need to keep our guard up, Detective Blake said. The bikers are connected to larger networks. We've arrested a lot of them, but we've also just made a lot of enemies. Emily leaned forward. We can't be passive. If they try to come back, we need to show them that we're not afraid to fight. Mike, ever the strategist, spoke up. We'll need to strengthen our patrols, reinforce our relationships with law enforcement, and keep gathering information. We can't afford to let them get comfortable again. Bill grinned. I say we start fixing up some of these roads and fences. Maybe make it harder for anyone to sneak around unnoticed. Joe was quiet for a long moment, his thoughts wandering. The biker gang had been the most visible threat, but there were other dangers out there. Smaller, more insidious threats that could undermine the peace they had fought for. You're right, Joe said finally. We've beaten them once, but we need to stay ahead of the curve. We'll do whatever it takes to keep this town safe. Later that evening, Joe sat at the edge of his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The town was quiet, peaceful even. It almost felt like before, the old rhythms of small-town life, the sound of crickets and rustling leaves. But everything had changed. It wasn't just the bikers they had to worry about anymore. Joe knew that as long as there were people willing to exploit fear, there would always be another threat. He glanced down at his phone, seeing a new message. It was from Mike. Got some intel. Another group, small but aggressive. They might be connected to Razor's network. I'll need backup soon. Joe's heart skipped. It had started. He quickly replied, I'll get Bill and Emily. We'll be ready. As night fell, the town began to stir with a different energy, an awareness of the ever-present danger, but also a steely determination. Every house was a fortress, every person a soldier in an unspoken war. Joe met up with Bill and Emily at the community center. The new intel Mike had gathered suggested that the bikers' allies were looking to move in, take over the territory Razor had once controlled. It was their first real challenge since the raid. We can't let them establish a foothold, Joe said. We need to meet them head-on before they start making moves. Bill pulled on his jacket, his face set with determination. I'm ready for round 2. Not just yet, Emily interjected. We need to be careful. A direct confrontation might escalate things faster than we can handle. Let's get more intel before we make our move. Joe nodded. You're right. We don't want to tip our hand too early. Mike sent them the coordinates of the new group's hideout, a small warehouse on the outskirts of town, hidden behind a series of dense trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a staging ground. They could see the flickering lights through the trees, and the occasional shadow moving in and out of the building. This was it. They had to act quickly before the group had a chance to organize. Joe, Bill, and Emily made their way to a nearby hill overlooking the warehouse, each of them outfitted with radios and their nerves on edge. The air was thick with tension. Mike, you in position? Joe whispered into the radio. Just got here, Mike's voice came through. I've got eyes on the target. They're still setting up. Stay sharp, Joe said. We'll wait for the right moment. It wasn't long before they heard the sound of motorcycles approaching. Joe tensed, motioning for Bill and Emily to crouch down behind the trees. The bikers were arriving. Razor's allies, whoever they were, had arrived. The question was, what would they do now? In that moment, Joe realized the fight was far from over. The road ahead was more complicated than he had anticipated, but he knew one thing for sure. He would stand strong, no matter what came next. What's your take on facing an enemy that just keeps coming back, stronger each time? How do you prepare for what's unknown? Let us know your thoughts below. The night was thick with tension. The motorcycles' rumbling engines grew louder as the bikers closed in on their hideout, just a few hundred yards away from Joe, Bill, and Emily's position. Joe's grip tightened around the handle of his flashlight, his breathing slow and steady. He couldn't afford to rush. Every decision they made now could be the difference between a victory and disaster. This is it, Emily whispered. Her eyes locked on the small clearing ahead. The group's setting up at the warehouse. It's a small operation, probably just a few dozen men, but it's enough to make a serious impact. Joe nodded, scanning the area. We need to hit them hard and fast. No warning. They won't expect it. Bill leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Are we sure this is the right call? We've got numbers, but they've got the experience. Emily shot him a sharp look. We don't have a choice. If they're connected to Razor's people, they'll try to take control. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to stop them. Joe, ever the calm strategist, took a deep breath. We need to make sure we hit them where it hurts. No killing. We take down their leaders, arrest as many as we can, and show them we're not afraid. Bill gave a small nod of agreement, though he still looked uneasy. Mike's voice came through their earpieces, sharp and clear. I've got eyes on the entrance. They're moving in, setting up some kind of lookout. If you're going to make a move, it's now or never. Joe's heart raced. The pieces were all falling into place. The ambush was about to begin. On my signal, Joe muttered, and the three of them slid silently into position. From the hilltop, the bikers were easy to spot. The harsh glow of their headlights cut through the dark, casting long shadows against the warehouse walls. There were at least 5 bikes parked near the entrance, and more riders clustered around the side of the building. They were talking in low voices, oblivious to the impending danger. Joe watched carefully. His pulse quickened, but his mind stayed sharp. This was the moment. Now. Joe barked into his radio. In a heartbeat, Bill and Emily surged forward, moving like shadows in the night. Joe wasn't far behind. They split into 2 groups. Bill and Emily would approach from the left, while Joe would flank from the right. The goal was to corner the bikers, cutting off their escape routes and forcing them into surrender. Mike's voice echoed in their earpieces again. They're starting to move. They're heading toward the back of the warehouse. They're planning something. That was all the confirmation Joe needed. The bikers were making a break for it. As Joe approached the rear of the building, he noticed a flicker of movement in the distance. There, just beyond the trees, were 2 men standing guard, scanning the area. They hadn't seen Joe and his team yet. Hold your fire, Joe whispered, crouching low. We can't tip our hand just yet. They crept closer, the silence surrounding them almost deafening. Then, Just as they neared the guards, Bill's voice crackled through the radio. "Joe, I've got a problem. 2 more riders just showed up. They're heading right toward you." Joe cursed under his breath. The bikers weren't as unaware as he had hoped. He had to act fast. With a sudden burst of movement, Joe lunged toward the first guard, knocking him to the ground before he had a chance to react. Bill and Emily quickly followed suit, taking down the second guard in seconds. The first part of the plan had worked. Now they just needed to keep the momentum going. As they quickly secured the guards, Mike's voice came through again. "I've got a visual on their leader. He's inside the warehouse, moving toward the back door. You need to get him before he escapes." "Copy that," Joe responded. He motioned for Bill and Emily to move forward. They dashed to the side of the warehouse, where a small door led to the interior. Joe's heart raced as they approached the entrance. The interior of the warehouse was eerily quiet. With every step, the tension mounted. The bikers were inside, and the moment they were seen, all hell would break loose. The door creaked open, and Joe peeked inside. There, in the back, was a figure pacing. The leader, no doubt, probably the same man who had taken over the operations in Razor's absence. "Now," Joe whispered. Bill and Emily rushed in, flanking the leader from both sides. Joe followed right behind them, his eyes locked on their target. The leader froze as he turned, seeing the 3 of them closing in. His hand instinctively went for his gun, but before he could make a move, Emily was on him, knocking the weapon from his hand. "Stay down," she commanded. Joe stepped forward, his voice cold. "You're under arrest for the trafficking of stolen goods, racketeering, and a list of other charges. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The leader sneered. "You think you've won? You're just a bunch of old people playing at being heroes. This town will fall, just like all the others." Joe's face tightened. "You can try, but this town isn't like the others. And you're not going anywhere." The leader scowled, but didn't resist as Bill and Emily cuffed him. Joe nodded to them. They had done it. The bikers, or at least their leadership, had been neutralized. By the time the last of the bikers was arrested and loaded into the police vans, the night was drawing to a close. The warehouse, once a center of chaos and fear, was now silent, the air heavy with the weight of their success. Mike, breathless from his own part of the operation, walked over to Joe. "We did it. We've got them all." Joe looked around at the wreckage of the bikers' operation. "We've got this one, Mike. But it's not over yet." Emily joined them, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "It never is it?" Joe smiled, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. The battle was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were finally on the right side of history. What do you think it takes to defeat a group that's always one step ahead? Is it strength, strategy, or something else? Share your thoughts below. The town was still buzzing with energy from the success of the previous night. Word had spread quickly, and while some of the residents were thrilled by the takedown of the biker gang, others were still uneasy. The realization had begun to set in that the danger was far from over. Joe sat on his porch early the next morning, nursing a cup of coffee. His mind was still racing, analyzing every move they made during the raid, wondering if they missed something, some small detail that could have tipped the balance in favor of the bikers. Bill walked up the steps, rubbing his eyes as he sat down beside Joe. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink." Joe shrugged, trying to mask the weariness in his bones. "Couldn't. Too much on my mind." Bill grinned. "I get it. But we did what we had to do. The town's breathing a little easier today." "Yeah, but for how long?" Joe asked, his eyes narrowing in thought. "We just took out the local chapter of a much bigger network. And that network won't just let it slide." Bill took a long sip of his coffee. "You're right. We got them, but we're probably on a list now. Still, I think the town's got your back. People feel safer." Joe nodded slowly, but the unease wouldn't go away. The bikers' threats might have been contained for now, but the bigger question lingered. What was the next move for them? Were there more factions out there? And how long would it be before someone else came looking for revenge? A voice broke through his thoughts. It was Emily, walking up the driveway, her expression grim. "Joe, we need to talk." He stood up, feeling the weight of her words before she even spoke. "What's going on?" She hesitated, then held up her phone. Mike just sent me an update. Looks like the bikers weren't the only ones in town. Joe raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. There's been a report about a new group, heavily armed, organized. And they're not just bikers. They've got connections to some serious players. International players. Bill let out a low whistle. So, it wasn't just a local gang we were dealing with? Emily shook her head. No. These people have more resources, more reach. They're dangerous. Joe's stomach churned. It was one thing to deal with the local bikers, but something bigger? That was a whole new ballgame. Do we know what they want? Emily glanced at her phone again. Not yet, but Mike's trying to track their movements. He's got a few contacts who are deep inside some of these networks. If we can get a lead, maybe we can cut them off before they even make their move. Joe's heart raced. They had been preparing for retaliation from Razor's people, but this was something else entirely. He turned to Bill. We need to prepare. Fast. This isn't just about protecting the town anymore. This is about stopping a full-scale operation. Bill nodded, his face hardening. I'll get the guys together. We'll start setting up perimeter defenses, fortifying the weak spots. We've been lucky so far. Joe glanced out at the horizon. The quiet morning was a stark contrast to the storm that was about to hit. The next few hours were filled with urgency. Mike sent regular updates, each more troubling than the last. The new group, whose name remained a mystery for now, was well-funded, highly skilled, and had connections to criminal syndicates across the globe. They were playing a long game, one that would extend far beyond just the small town Joe had been fighting for. Joe, Emily, Bill, and Mike huddled together at the community center, where they had gathered the key leaders of the town. We don't know much about them yet, Mike said, showing them a grainy photo on his phone of a man in a suit shaking hands with a biker. But we know that whoever they are, they've got resources. And they're not afraid to use them. Joe took a deep breath, trying to process the gravity of the situation. We've already taken down one dangerous group, but this is different. If they have international ties, that means we're up against something much bigger. Emily leaned forward. But we don't know what they want. If it's money, that's one thing. If it's control, that's another. We need to figure out their endgame before we make any rash decisions. Joe agreed. The first thing we need to do is gather intel. We'll work with law enforcement, and Mike, you keep in touch with your sources. We need to know where they're hiding, who their leaders are, and what they want. The longer we wait, the more ground they'll take. Mike nodded. Got it. I'll keep you posted as soon as I know more. Bill stood up, cracking his knuckles. I'll get the team ready. We're not letting anyone take control of this town. Joe glanced at the map pinned to the wall, his finger tracing the borders of their small town. It felt like they were standing on the edge of something huge, something dangerous. For the first time in a long while, Joe felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders more than ever. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for everyone in this town. The quiet was broken by the sudden roar of motorcycles, distant at first, but growing steadily closer. Joe's eyes shot to the window. Not again, he muttered under his breath. Emily, always alert, was already at the door. Joe, stay back. We need to be careful. This could be them. Joe didn't need to be told twice. The battle had only just begun. He turned to his team, his voice steely with resolve. Get to your positions. We're not letting anyone slip by us this time. Not even a whisper. The time for quiet contemplation was over. The storm had arrived, and Joe was ready to face it head-on. What's the hardest part of preparing for an unknown enemy? Is it the uncertainty, the waiting, or something else? Let us know your thoughts below. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder, and the air seemed to hum with an electric tension. Joe stood by the window, his hand gripping the frame as he watched the dust kick up in the distance. His instincts were sharp, and every fiber in his being told him that this wasn't just a random group of bikers riding through town. Emily moved swiftly to his side, her eyes scanning the horizon. They're closing in faster than we expected. We need to decide what to do now, or it'll be too late. Joe nodded, his mind racing. They had hoped to be better prepared for this moment, but it seemed the enemy was always one step ahead. His heart pounded in his chest as he weighed their options. We need to get a head start on this, he said, turning to Bill, who was already assembling their team. Get the lookout posts set up. If we can get the drop on them before they hit the town, we can turn this around. Bill gave a curt nod. We'll be ready, but I've got a bad feeling about this. It's not just about control anymore. These guys, whoever they are playing for keeps. Joe's eyes narrowed. He had no intention of letting these people take anything from his town, but the reality was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a battle for the soul of the community. Emily stood at the door, peering out through the cracked blinds. They're stopping. There's something going on. Looks like they're waiting for orders. Or reinforcements, Joe muttered, his jaw tightening. Mike's voice crackled in their earpieces. Joe, you're not going to like this. They've got more than just bikers with them. A few black SUVs just rolled up, and it looks like they're setting up some kind of perimeter. This is bad, Joe. Joe's blood ran cold. How many? Mike hesitated. At least a dozen armed men. They're well coordinated, and they're not here just for a casual visit. Joe's mind raced. If this was a larger operation, the town would be completely outmatched. They needed to move fast, to create confusion, to buy time. We can't let them surround us. We need to take out their communication lines, Joe said. Bill, you know the area around the old mill? Bill nodded. Yeah, why? I need you to get there fast. Set up a relay station, a place where we can coordinate out of sight. It'll give us a tactical advantage. Bill didn't hesitate. I'm on it. Emily stepped forward, concern etched in her features. And what about you? You'll be out in the open. Joe met her gaze with determination. I'll hold the line. We can't let them get any closer. If they think we're divided, they'll attack in force. We have to make them believe we're stronger than we are. Emily didn't like the plan, but she understood. Be careful. With that, the team sprang into action. Joe made his way to the center of town, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. The streets were eerily quiet now, the calm before the storm. He knew the bikers and their new allies were preparing for something big, but they hadn't anticipated the kind of resistance they were about to face. As Joe reached the main intersection, he saw the first signs of movement. 3 motorcycles revved their engines, slowly cruising into the heart of town. The men on the bikes were scanning the area, looking for any sign of opposition. Joe took cover behind an abandoned storefront, his heart pounding. He didn't dare make a move yet. The key to survival was timing, and he needed to pick the perfect moment to strike. Suddenly, the sound of a car door slamming shut echoed through the street. Joe's eyes darted to the black SUVs parked just beyond the bikes. More men were stepping out, armed with rifles and looking far more disciplined than the bikers. These weren't just criminals, they were mercenaries. This is getting out of hand, Joe muttered under his breath. As the mercenaries began setting up barricades and equipment, Joe's mind raced through the possibilities. They were preparing for an assault, but they were also waiting for something, or someone. Was it a leader, an informant, or reinforcements from elsewhere? He couldn't afford to wait any longer. Joe tapped his earpiece, his voice low but urgent. Mike, you see anything? What's their next move? Mike's voice came through clear, but tense. They've got their sights set on the local bank. They're setting up for something big, Joe. Whatever they're doing, they need a secure route in. And it's not just about the money. They're moving a lot of valuable equipment. Joe's pulse quickened. If they were targeting the bank, it wasn't about robbery. It was a strategic move. Whatever was inside those walls, these men were willing to risk it all. They're getting ready to move, Mike continued. You need to act fast. I'm sending reinforcements, but it's going to take time. Joe scanned the area, seeing the mercenaries continue to fortify their position. The clock was ticking. He tapped into the comm system again, this time calling out to Bill. Bill, are you in position? I'm almost there, came Bill's response. How do you want me to play this? Joe's fingers drummed against the side of the building as he thought quickly. Take the high ground. Create a diversion. I need them distracted while Emily and I get to the bank. Got it, Bill said, his voice cutting out as he made his way to position himself. Joe took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. He and Emily would need to move fast, hit hard, and make sure that they had the element of surprise. This wasn't just a fight for control anymore. It was a fight for their lives. As Joe and Emily advanced toward the bank, the faint sound of gunfire erupted in the distance. Bill was doing his part, drawing the enemy's attention and drawing them away from the bank. Joe's heart raced, but his focus remained razor-sharp. There was no room for mistakes. If they could break into the heart of the operation, they could stop the mercenaries from getting what they wanted, and maybe even uncover what they were after in the first place. As the door to the bank loomed ahead, Joe whispered to Emily, "Ready?" She gave him a grim nod. "Let's end this." What do you think makes a hero in times of uncertainty? Is it bravery, strategy, or something more? Share your thoughts below. The sound of distant gunfire continued to echo through the air as Joe and Emily approached the bank, their footsteps quick but calculated. The tension was palpable. Everything hinged on their next move. Bill had drawn the enemy's attention, but that didn't mean they had much time. The mercenaries weren't idiots. They would regroup soon enough. Joe's hand was steady as he pushed open the heavy door of the bank, its brass hinges groaning under the weight. He motioned for Emily to follow him closely, and they slipped inside, the air cool and stale. The bank, usually a place of routine business, now felt like a war zone. Dim lights flickered above, and the once orderly counters were now scattered with overturned chairs and papers. Joe's mind was racing, trying to keep track of every detail. They had to move quickly. If the mercenaries were inside, they were likely searching for something specific. Maybe it wasn't just the building they were after. It could be something far more valuable hidden within its walls. He motioned for Emily to stay close as they moved silently through the lobby. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was no sign of movement. The silence felt unnerving, almost too quiet. Suddenly, the faint sound of footsteps reached their ears. Joe pressed himself against the wall, signaling for Emily to do the same. They waited, hearts pounding, as the footsteps grew closer. Then, just as they had anticipated, 3 men emerged from a side hallway, their rifles slung over their shoulders. The mercenaries moved with purpose, scanning the area with cold precision. "Stay quiet," Joe whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily nodded, and they held their breath, waiting for the men to pass. The seconds felt like hours. The tension in the air was thick, and Joe's thoughts raced. What were they after? Were they looking for the vault? Or was there something else hidden deeper in the bank? Finally, the mercenaries moved on, and Joe exhaled slowly, his heart still racing. He glanced at Emily, his eyes determined. "We don't have much time. Let's move." They continued deeper into the bank, their steps cautious. Joe's mind kept turning over the possibilities. They were being careful, yes, but there was something about this operation that didn't add up. Why the bank? Why this town? They reached a hallway that led toward the vault area. As Joe approached, he could hear muffled voices from beyond the door. The mercenaries were close, and they were talking in low tones, likely communicating with someone outside. Joe motioned for Emily to take cover behind a pillar, his instincts kicking in. The sound of the conversation grew clearer, and he could make out a few words. "In position, securing the asset." Joe's heart skipped a beat. Asset? What were they after in the vault? This wasn't just a robbery. This was something far bigger. "Stay here," Joe whispered to Emily. "I'm going to check it out." She nodded, but there was a look of concern in her eyes. "Be careful, Joe. We don't know how many are in there." He didn't respond, but he knew she was right. Still, he had to see it for himself. He moved quickly and quietly, edging closer to the door, careful not to make a sound. Through the small crack in the door, Joe's eyes adjusted to the dim light within. What he saw made his blood run cold. Inside the vault room were several large crates, stacked one on top of the other. But they weren't filled with money. Instead, they were filled with equipment, military-grade gear, weapons, and what appeared to be high-tech devices that Joe couldn't identify. "This is bigger than we thought," Joe muttered to himself. The mercenaries weren't just after cash. They were smuggling something far more dangerous. Suddenly, a voice called out from inside the room. "Is everything ready for transport?" Joe tensed, his instinct screaming that he had to act fast. But before he could make a move, the door to the vault room creaked open slightly, and one of the mercenaries stepped out. Joe quickly backed away, pressing himself into the shadows. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest. If the mercenary saw him, there would be no chance of escape. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. The mercenary stepped out, his eyes scanning the hallway. Joe held his breath, praying that he wouldn't be spotted. After what felt like an eternity, the mercenary turned, heading back inside the vault room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Joe's heart pounded as he waited for him to disappear, then quickly moved toward the crack in the door once again. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. Joe peeked through the opening and saw the crates, now fully revealed. There were a few men inside the room, but the items they were loading into the crates weren't just weapons. They were something far more significant. Advanced technology, with markings that were unmistakable. This isn't just a gang. Joe's mind raced. This was a well-organized, highly funded operation, one that extended far beyond the bikers and mercenaries Joe had been dealing with. This was part of something much bigger, something that could have global implications. But before he could process further, a voice cut through the tension. "What are you doing here?" Joe froze, his blood running cold. He turned around slowly to see Emily, standing at the far end of the hallway. Her face was pale, eyes wide with shock. The mercenaries inside the vault room heard her voice too. "Emily, no!" Joe shouted, but it was too late. The men in the vault room had already turned, and they were heading for the door. Joe's pulse quickened. They had to move now. How far would you go to stop something that could threaten everything you've worked for? What's the line between protecting what's yours and risking it all for something bigger? The footsteps echoed down the hallway, their sound growing louder by the second. Emily's face was a mix of confusion and fear, and Joe could see her freeze as the men from the vault room began to march toward them. "Emily, run!" Joe hissed, his voice barely audible. His instincts kicked in, urging him to protect her at all costs. But he knew they were outnumbered, and the moment they were seen, everything would fall apart. But Emily didn't move. Her eyes locked onto Joe's with a determination that caught him off guard. "I'm not leaving you, Joe," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the panic in her eyes. She stepped closer to him, her hand brushing his arm as if to reassure herself. Joe could feel his heart race, knowing they didn't have much time. "We don't have a choice. We need to get out of here now." But before he could grab her arm, the sound of a door slamming open sent a chill through him. The mercenaries had reached the hallway. There were 4 of them, all heavily armed and dressed in tactical gear. Joe's hand instinctively went to his side, where the small pistol he carried rested against his belt. But even with the element of surprise, he knew there was no way he could take them all down quickly enough. "Hands in the air," one of the mercenaries barked. His voice was cold, demanding obedience. Joe and Emily didn't move at first, neither willing to give in just yet. Joe's mind was already running through possibilities. How could they fight their way out of this? He didn't want to shoot unless it was absolutely necessary, but they were running out of options fast. "Now!" the mercenary shouted again, taking a step closer, his rifle raised. Joe's heart pounded, and in that split second, he made a decision. He grabbed Emily's wrist, pulling her to the side as a burst of gunfire rang out. It wasn't aimed at them, but it was close enough to make them both flinch. They ducked into a nearby office, the door slamming shut behind them. Joe's breath was heavy, his mind racing. "We need to think fast." He looked around the small room, desperate for any advantage. There has to be another way out of here. Emily's eyes darted to the small window near the back wall, and she stepped forward. "We could climb out and head for the back alley," she suggested, her voice calmer than Joe had expected. Joe took a deep breath, considering it. He knew the bank's layout well enough to know that the back alley led to a series of warehouses, offering cover. It was their best shot. "Let's do it," Joe said. "But we have to move quickly." As Emily pushed the window open, Joe scanned the hallway through a crack in the door. The mercenaries were still checking the vault area, giving them a few moments to make their escape. Joe's pulse quickened with every passing second. He motioned for Emily to go first. As she climbed out of the window, he followed, making sure to stay low and avoid drawing attention. They dropped down into the narrow alley, the cool evening air a stark contrast to the heat of the bank. They didn't speak as they moved quickly through the shadows, keeping close to the walls and out of sight. Joe's mind was racing. What were the mercenaries after, And why had they chosen this town? Everything about this operation screamed of something much larger than a simple heist. As they turned a corner, Joe felt the weight of the situation settle over him. This wasn't just about protecting the town anymore. It was about uncovering a conspiracy that could have far-reaching consequences. They reached a warehouse at the end of the alley, and Joe ushered Emily inside. It was dark, the only light coming from a faint crack beneath the door. The warehouse was empty, save for a few old crates stacked in the corners. "We need to figure out what's going on," Joe said quietly, his voice tight with urgency. "There's something they're not telling us, and we need to find out what it is." Emily nodded, her face pale but resolute. "What's the plan?" Joe didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the back door, cracking it open slightly to survey the street. He could see the faint outlines of a few cars parked outside, but the mercenaries had spread out, likely looking for them. "We wait here for now," Joe said. "Bill should be getting close, and once we're all together, we'll figure out our next move." Back at the bank, the mercenaries had begun to regroup. One of them, a man with a scar across his face, spoke into a radio, his voice sharp with impatience. "They're on the move. We need to track them down before they can make it to the safe house." The scarred man's eyes flicked toward the bank's vault once again. "Whatever's in there, it's not just a payday anymore. It's bigger than we thought. Find them." Joe and Emily had settled into a tense silence, both of them fully aware that their window of safety was shrinking by the minute. They had made it out of the bank, but that was only the beginning of what was turning into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Joe's mind kept going back to the crates in the vault, the high-tech devices, the advanced military equipment. It didn't add up. Who would be interested in something like that? And why target a small town like this? As his thoughts swirled, the sound of footsteps outside the warehouse door brought him back to the present. "Stay quiet," he whispered to Emily, his hand resting on the gun at his side. They both crouched low, eyes fixed on the door. Was this it? Had the mercenaries tracked them down? Or was this the first step to something even bigger? Do you think the mercenaries are working for someone else? Who could be behind all of this? Share your theories in the comments below. The tension inside the warehouse was suffocating. Joe could hear his own breath, shallow and quick, as he peered through the crack in the door. Emily's eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear and determination. She stood still, barely making a sound. But Joe knew the weight of the situation was settling heavily on both of them. The footsteps grew louder, and with every step, Joe's grip tightened around the handle of his gun. His mind raced. Who were these people? The mercenaries had to be connected to something far larger than a simple heist. But who could orchestrate something of this magnitude? He slowly moved toward the back corner of the warehouse, motioning for Emily to follow him. They needed a plan, something more than just running. He had to figure out what was at stake here before they got caught in the crossfire. As the footsteps outside grew closer, Joe heard a soft voice, barely audible, but unmistakably close. "They've got to be here. There's nowhere else they could have gone." The voice wasn't coming from the direction of the street, but from the side of the warehouse. A chill ran down Joe's spine. The mercenaries weren't just hunting them. They were already surrounding the place. "Ready?" Joe whispered to Emily. She gave him a nod, her face grim. Her confidence was a small comfort in the midst of everything, but Joe knew that this was no time to hesitate. The footsteps stopped right outside the warehouse door. Joe's breath caught in his throat as he listened, every muscle in his body coiled tight. He knew the only way out of this was to fight back, but they couldn't afford to be reckless. If they didn't think this through, they would end up just like all the others who had crossed paths with these mercenaries. There was a faint click, the sound of a gun being cocked. Emily's eyes met his, and they both knew it was now or never. Before the mercenaries had a chance to open the door, Joe darted toward the back of the warehouse, his hand pulling Emily along with him. They moved fast, their footsteps light, their hearts pounding in their chests. They reached a narrow door in the back corner, an emergency exit, likely forgotten by most people who worked there. Joe's hand flew to the handle, but just as he was about to push it open, a shout rang out from outside. "Don't let them get away." It was too late to go back. The mercenaries had already seen them, or at least, they had caught wind of their escape plan. Joe swung the door open, and they both slipped into the dark alleyway behind the warehouse. The air was cold and damp, but the sense of urgency was enough to keep them moving. They ran as quietly as they could, weaving through the narrow passageways, hoping they weren't being followed. But Joe knew that time was running out. They had to find out who was behind this operation, and they had to do it fast. As they rounded a corner, Joe spotted a familiar figure in the distance. Bill. He was standing near the end of the alley, scanning the area with sharp eyes. The moment he saw Joe and Emily, he waved them over. "Come on. They're not far behind," Bill said, his voice low but urgent. He motioned for them to follow as he darted down another alleyway, a route that Joe knew well. "Any idea who these guys are?" Joe asked as they ran. Bill glanced over his shoulder, his expression grim. "I don't know yet, but whatever this is, it's more than just a gang of bikers. I'm thinking we're dealing with a mercenary force, a professional one. These guys have been hired for something specific, and I think we've stumbled into the middle of it." Joe nodded, his thoughts racing. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The more he learned, the deeper the mystery became. What was in that vault? And who was powerful enough to pull all the strings? Bill led them through a series of alleyways, avoiding the main streets. They eventually emerged onto a quiet street lined with small shops. Bill stopped and checked both ways before signaling them to follow him into a nearby building. Inside, the room was dimly lit, a quiet space with dusty furniture. A safe house. One of Bill's old contacts had offered it up as a temporary hideout. It was far enough off the beaten path that they could regroup without worrying about being immediately found. Joe slumped against the wall, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. He was trying to process everything. The mercenaries, the crates in the bank, the strange equipment. They were all connected, but he had no idea how. Bill walked over to a table and began pulling out his phone. "I need to make a call. Someone who might know more about these mercenaries." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "These guys have a reputation, Joe. They've been involved in some serious operations. Whatever's in that bank vault is big, bigger than we thought." Joe rubbed his temples, trying to think. What about the technology? The military-grade stuff we saw in the vault? What are they doing with it? Bill sighed, placing his phone down. "I've heard rumors about black market weapons and technology. But this is different. Whoever's pulling the strings has deep pockets. I'm thinking global scale." Emily, who had been standing by quietly, finally spoke up. "So what do we do now?" Joe stood up, his jaw set with determination. "We find out who's behind this, and we stop them. Whatever it takes." Outside, the quiet of the night was shattered by the sound of approaching cars. The mercenaries had found their trail, and they were closing in fast. But Joe and his team were no longer just running. They were preparing for the next phase of the battle. They had their backs against the wall, but they weren't going down without a fight. The game had changed, and now there was no turning back. Who do you think is behind the mercenary operation? What's their endgame? Share your theories and thoughts in the comments below. The air in the safe house felt thick, suffocating even. The weight of what they were facing pressed down on Joe as he paced the small room. The call Bill had made had only added to the growing tension. Whoever was behind this operation wasn't just dangerous. They were a well-oiled machine. A force that moved through the shadows, pulling strings and orchestrating events from behind the scenes. Bill's phone call had been brief but urgent. Joe could tell from the grim expression on Bill's face that they were dealing with something far beyond their initial assumptions. "They're not just mercenaries," Bill said, his voice low, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "These guys are working for someone. Someone big." Joe stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto Bill's. "Who?" Bill hesitated for a moment before replying. "I don't know, but it's a name I've heard whispered about in certain circles. A name tied to powerful people. A global syndicate. And they've got their hands in everything. Politics, weapons, technology. They don't just operate in the shadows. They control them." Emily, who had been sitting quietly, absorbing the information, finally spoke up. "So, what does this have to do with the bank? Why target this town? What's in that vault?" Joe could see the frustration in her eyes. She wanted answers just as much as he did. They all did. But Joe knew that, at this point, It was less about the vault and more about the bigger picture. "Whatever's in that vault," Joe said, his voice tight with determination, "it's a key to something much larger, something that whoever's behind this wants, and they'll stop at nothing to get it." Bill nodded. "They're not after money. They're after power. The tech in that vault, it's not just military grade. It's cutting edge. Weapons, surveillance systems, and communication tech. Things that could turn the tide in a war. But that's just the beginning. There's something bigger, something they're using all this to get to." Joe felt a shiver run down his spine. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they were still too far apart to form a clear picture. What could possibly be worth all this risk? Why the small town? Why the mercenaries? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. But Joe couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was ticking. He turned to Bill. "We need to find out what's in that vault. We need to get ahead of them before they make their next move." Bill nodded in agreement. "I've got a contact. Someone who might know more about the vault's contents. But we need to move fast. If we don't, we'll be walking right into their trap." Joe felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about saving the town anymore. This was about stopping a global power from seizing something that could tip the balance of everything. They didn't have much time. Hours later, they were back on the move. The mercenaries were still hunting them, but Joe and his team had managed to stay one step ahead. They knew they couldn't outrun them forever, so they devised a new plan. They had to strike first. Bill's contact, a former intelligence officer, had agreed to meet them at a secluded cabin outside of town. If anyone had the information they needed, it was him. As they pulled up to the cabin, Joe felt the weight of the moment. Everything had led to this. They were about to learn who was truly behind the mercenary operation and what they were willing to do to get what was hidden in that vault. They exited the car and approached the cabin with caution. Bill knocked on the door, his hand hovering over the handle of his gun. The door creaked open, and a man in his late 40s stood in the doorway. He was lean, with graying hair and a sharp gaze. There was no mistaking the years of experience etched into his face. This was a man who had seen more than his share of danger and lived to tell about it. "Bill," the man said, his voice gravelly, "you brought company." "This is Joe and Emily," Bill said, introducing them. "They're the ones who stumbled into this mess. They're looking for answers." The man eyed them both carefully before stepping aside. "Come in," he said. "We don't have much time." Inside, the cabin was sparse with only the essentials: an old wood-burning stove, a few chairs, and a table cluttered with maps and documents. The man moved to the table and started flipping through the papers. "So, you're after the vault," he said, his tone flat. "I've heard about it. It's not what you think." Joe's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The man looked up from the papers, his eyes dark with suspicion. "You think it's just some stash of weapons, don't you? A military-grade cache that someone's trying to sell on the black market. But that's only part of it. What's in that vault could change everything." He pulled a folder from the stack of papers and slid it across the table. Joe reached for it, feeling a sense of urgency rising in his chest. He opened it, revealing a series of photographs. One showed a high-tech piece of equipment that looked like a cross between a satellite and a communications device. Another showed a map, locations across the globe, marked with red XS. "This," the man said, pointing to the photographs, "is what they're after. The technology inside that vault is a prototype. It's not just weapons, it's control. They can manipulate communications, surveillance, even weapon systems. They can use it to control entire countries." Joe felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Who's behind this?" The man's eyes flicked to the window nervously. "I can't say for sure, but whoever they are, they have connections everywhere. Governments, corporations, military contractors. The people you're dealing with are more dangerous than you can imagine. They don't just want power, they want total control." Joe's mind raced as the weight of the revelation sank in. What they were up against wasn't just a group of mercenaries. They were dealing with an international network, a hidden empire with the ability to change the course of history. They had to stop them. Now, who do you think is really behind this global conspiracy? What's their next move? Share your theories below. The night was eerily quiet as Joe, Emily, and Bill sat in the cabin, processing the new information. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but inside, it was as if time had slowed to a crawl. The world felt heavy with secrets. Secrets that, if they weren't uncovered soon, could destroy everything. Joe leaned back in his chair, staring at the maps spread out on the table. The red XS scattered across the world like markers in a game, each one representing a place where the tech in the vault could be used to tip the balance of power. Military outposts, satellite stations, government buildings, every place was a potential target. The more Joe thought about it, the more he realized just how far-reaching the implications were. "They have to be stopped," he muttered under his breath, barely aware he was speaking aloud. Emily sat across from him, her eyes focused on the same map, though her expression was a mix of confusion and determination. "What exactly are we dealing with here? This isn't just some terrorist organization, is it?" Bill, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke. "No, it's much worse than that. This isn't just about money or power. This is about control. They've been infiltrating governments, corporations, hell, even the military. And now they're moving forward with this plan, using that tech to create a system where they can manipulate everything from communications to weapons." He paused, and Joe could feel the weight of the words. Bill continued, his voice lowering. "We're talking about a shadow government, one that can topple entire nations without ever showing its face. And they're using the vault to make it happen." Joe stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back. His fists clenched. "So what? We just let them take over? We sit back and wait for them to use this technology to enslave the world?" "No," Bill said firmly. "We stop them. But we need to be smart about it. This isn't something we can just storm in and fight head-on. They've anticipated that. We have to hit them where it hurts, where they don't see us coming." Joe's mind raced as he thought through their options. The mercenaries weren't just hired guns. They were part of a much bigger machine, a well-coordinated force that had been set in motion long before Joe and Emily even realized it. Stopping them wasn't going to be easy. "We need a plan," Joe said, his voice steady but resolute. "We need to figure out where they're taking the tech, who's running the operation, and how we can stop it. The sooner we can get to the heart of it, the better." Emily stood up, her eyes narrowing. "We can't keep playing defense. We have to strike before they get any further. If they've already set things in motion, there's no telling what kind of damage they can do." Bill nodded, looking at both of them. "Agreed. But we'll need allies. We can't do this alone." "Do you have anyone in mind?" Joe asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Allies in a fight this big didn't come easily. Everyone had a price, and Joe wasn't sure who to trust anymore. Bill hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I do, but they're not going to be easy to reach. This group is more underground than we thought. We'll need to make some serious moves if we want to get their help." Joe ran a hand through his hair. Time was running out. Every minute they wasted, the mercenaries and whoever was backing them got closer to their goal. But how far were they willing to go to stop them? How much of their own safety were they willing to sacrifice for the greater good? Suddenly, a sharp knock at the door broke his thoughts. It was quick, deliberate. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Bill?" A voice called from outside. Bill's eyes flicked to the door, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his side. Without a word, he stood and moved cautiously toward the door, signaling Joe and Emily to stay quiet. Joe's heart skipped a beat, wondering if this was an ally or an enemy. Bill opened the door just a crack, his face tense. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Bill stepped back, allowing the figure outside to enter. The man who stepped into the cabin was tall, with short-cropped hair and a military bearing. His eyes were cold and calculating, but there was no mistaking the recognition in his gaze when he locked eyes with Joe. "Jonathan Wills," the man said, his voice steady, almost too calm. "We've been expecting you." Joe didn't recognize the name, but Bill's reaction was immediate. "You're with them." Jonathan didn't flinch at Bill's accusation. Instead, he simply nodded. "I was, but I'm not anymore. And right now, I'm your best chance at stopping this." Joe exchanged a glance with Emily. This wasn't a time for second-guessing. They needed help, and it seemed like Jonathan had the knowledge they were desperately searching for. "I don't trust you," Joe said bluntly, his hand still resting on the gun at his side. Jonathan gave a short, dry laugh. I'm not asking for your trust, Joe. I'm offering you information. A way in. But you need to act fast. Time is running out. Bill stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Jonathan's face. What do you know about the people behind the mercenaries? They've got a tight grip on everything, Jonathan said, his expression darkening. Global intelligence, shadowy politicians, even military contractors. But there's one thing they didn't count on. A leak? Someone on the inside who's tired of the game. And that's where I come in. Joe's eyes narrowed. What do you want in return? Jonathan didn't hesitate. I want the same thing you do, to bring them down. But I'll need your help to do it. You get me to the vault, and I'll show you how to use their own network against them. We can turn the tables. The room fell silent. Joe felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. Could they trust this man? Or was he just another cog in the machine, playing both sides? We're running out of options, Bill said, breaking the silence. We don't have the luxury of being picky. Joe looked at Emily, who gave a subtle nod, as if to say, let's take the chance. Joe turned back to Jonathan. All right, you're in. But if this turns out to be a trick, we'll end it right here. Jonathan's lips curled into a faint smile. Understood. As he spoke, the tension in the room seemed to dissipate, if only slightly. Joe didn't fully trust Jonathan, but in this war, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. The storm was coming. But now, with an unexpected ally, they might just have a fighting chance. Do you think Jonathan is telling the truth, or is he playing his own game? Can they trust him to help them stop this operation? Share your thoughts below. The air in the cabin was thick with uncertainty. Every second felt like a countdown, the tension hanging over them like a storm cloud. Joe, Emily, and Bill sat around the small table, eyes fixed on Jonathan as he explained the plan. Getting into the vault is only part of it, Jonathan said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. The real challenge is what comes next. The tech inside. If we don't disable their network quickly, they'll be able to launch a full-scale operation within hours. We can't let that happen. Bill leaned forward, his eyes sharp. So how do we get to the vault? How do we get through their security? Jonathan's eyes flicked to Joe, then back to Bill. We have to move fast. Their security is tight, but we've got a window of opportunity. There's a back door, one that's been compromised by an insider. I know where it is, but it's not just about getting in. We have to disable the systems from the inside before they can activate the tech. Joe felt the weight of the plan settle in. This wasn't going to be easy. There were too many variables, too many unknowns. But at this point, they didn't have much choice. The world outside their small circle was on the brink of disaster, and if they didn't act now, it might be too late. Emily spoke up, her voice steady despite the fear that lingered in her eyes. And what happens if we fail? Jonathan's gaze hardened. If we fail, everything will be lost. The tech in that vault is a game changer. They'll be able to manipulate entire networks, control governments, economies, militaries. It's not just a weapon. It's a system that will make them untouchable. Joe clenched his jaw. The stakes had never been higher. He glanced at Emily and Bill. We don't have time to waste. If we're doing this, we do it now. Bill nodded. Right. We need to get moving. The longer we wait, the more chances they have to figure out what we're up to. Jonathan stood and started gathering his things. I've already mapped out the route. But once we get inside, you need to stick to the plan. No room for mistakes. If anyone hesitates or deviates, it'll cost us everything. Joe met his gaze. Understood. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the future. If they failed, the world as they knew it would change forever. The tech in that vault wasn't just a prize for the mercenaries. It was a weapon of unimaginable power. The night was dark as they made their way toward the facility. The moon hung low in the sky, barely casting any light on the winding road ahead. Joe, Emily, Bill, and Jonathan moved in silence, their faces set with determination. The weight of their mission pressed on them, but there was no turning back now. The closer they got to the facility, the more tense the air became. The compound loomed ahead, its high walls and barbed wire fences intimidating. Guards patrolled the perimeter, and the faint glow of security cameras illuminated the shadows. Jonathan led them to a small, hidden entrance at the back of the compound, well out of sight from the main security. "This is it," he whispered. "Once we're in, we move fast. No second chances." They nodded, each of them ready for whatever came next. Joe's hand rested on the grip of his gun, his senses heightened, every footstep echoing like a drumbeat in his mind. This was it, the moment of truth. They crossed the threshold, stepping into the shadows of the compound. Jonathan moved with the precision of someone who had done this many times before, signaling them to follow closely. They navigated through a series of service corridors, avoiding the guards and security cameras with ease. Jonathan stopped in front of a heavy steel door, punching in a series of codes on a keypad. The door clicked open, and they slipped inside. "Security's down for the moment," Jonathan said in a hushed voice, glancing over his shoulder. "We have 5 minutes before they realize the breach." Joe's heart was racing. 5 minutes. It was nothing. They had to move faster. They made their way down a narrow hallway, past locked doors and sealed rooms. Every step they took felt like a step deeper into the heart of the enemy's lair. Joe kept his focus, his thoughts clear. Nothing else mattered now except stopping them. The vault was at the end of the hall, behind a massive reinforced door. Security was heavy, but with Jonathan's help, they had gained access. Joe's pulse quickened as they approached the vault, the door looming ahead like a final barrier. Jonathan quickly went to work, typing commands into a nearby terminal. "I'm disabling the alarm system," he muttered. "Give me a minute." Joe turned to Emily and Bill. "We're almost there. Stay alert." The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Joe could hear his own breath, the beat of his heart thudding in his chest. If they didn't get in and disable the tech soon, it would be too late. Finally, the terminal beeped, and the massive door to the vault began to open with a groan of metal on metal. They rushed inside, the cold air of the vault sweeping over them as they stepped into the heart of the operation. Rows of equipment lined the walls, glowing with a menacing light. But it wasn't just the tech that caught Joe's eye. It was the large, sealed case in the center of the room. Jonathan moved toward it. "This is it, the heart of the operation." Joe could see the faint outline of a futuristic device, encased in the transparent box. The technology was unlike anything he had ever seen. Sleek, precise, and ominous. But before they could even begin to approach, the door slammed shut behind them. Joe spun around, eyes wide with realization. It's a trap. The stakes are higher than ever. Will Joe and his team manage to escape the trap and stop the tech from falling into the wrong hands? What do you think will happen next? Drop your theories below. The heavy metallic thud of the door slamming shut echoed through the vault, drowning out all other sounds. Joe's heart raced as his hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape route. The air felt thick, suffocating, too still for comfort. The walls of the vault seemed to close in on them, and the faint hum of the machinery around them now felt like the sound of a ticking clock. "We've been compromised," Joe said, his voice tight with urgency. "Get to the tech now." But before they could move, a cold, mechanical voice echoed through the room. "You are now in containment. Any attempt to access or tamper with vault contents will be met with lethal force." Jonathan cursed under his breath and quickly scanned the walls, looking for any hidden control panels or emergency exits. "They've triggered the lockdown," he muttered. "We can't get out the same way we came in. We need to move fast and disable the system before they activate the tech." Joe's pulse quickened as the room's lights flickered, then dimmed, casting long shadows across the vault. The sleek technology in the center of the room pulsed with an eerie blue glow, as if aware of its own power. Joe couldn't shake the feeling that the tech inside the vault was more than just a collection of advanced devices. It was a weapon, a key to controlling the world's most critical networks. Bill stepped up beside him, his face grim. "We've got to get to that tech. The moment they activate it, we lose any chance of stopping them." Emily's eyes were locked on the massive steel door that had just sealed them in. Her voice was low, controlled. "We don't have much time. If we're going to make it out, we need to disable the system, and we need to do it now." Jonathan moved quickly, typing furiously on a nearby terminal, but his face twisted in frustration when the screen flashed a warning. Unauthorized access. "We need the passcode," Jonathan said, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "And I don't have it." Joe's mind raced. The mercenaries weren't just hired guns. They had planned for everything, and they knew exactly how to keep the vault secure. If they couldn't disable the system now, they would be trapped for good, and the tech would fall into the wrong hands. "Any other ideas?" Joe asked, his voice sharp. Jonathan paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the walls again. "I know a backdoor. Well, I knew a backdoor. But it's risky. There's a manual override, but it's deep in the vault, beyond the security systems. We'll have to move fast." Joe didn't hesitate. "Then let's move. Bill, Emily, keep an eye on the room. We can't afford any surprises." The four of them moved toward the back of the vault, weaving through the rows of advanced equipment. As they walked, Joe's mind kept returning to the device at the center of the room, the one that had the power to change everything. He could feel the weight of the decision on his shoulders. They weren't just fighting for their survival anymore. They were fighting to protect the future. Suddenly, the silence of the vault was shattered by a mechanical whir. A series of lights along the ceiling blinked to life, casting an ominous red glow. Then, a voice rang out over the intercom. "Warning, security breach detected. Lockdown in effect. Deployment of containment units in 30 seconds. "Damn it," Jonathan muttered. "We've got less than a minute before they send in reinforcements." The countdown was like a ticking clock in their heads. Joe's heart hammered in his chest as he moved with purpose, forcing his legs to carry him toward the manual override. They couldn't let the countdown finish. They couldn't let the mercenaries get any closer. They reached the far side of the vault, where a hidden door slid open silently, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the heart of the facility. The air was colder here, and the faint hum of the machines faded into a low, ominous rumble. Jonathan stepped forward and quickly activated another control panel, his hands moving with practiced precision. A door in front of them slid open, revealing a small, dark room. Inside, a terminal sat in the center of the room, its screen blinking with a steady green light. Jonathan didn't waste any time. He moved to the terminal and plugged in a small device he had been carrying. The screen flickered for a moment before flashing a warning. "Access denied." "This is it," Jonathan muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "I need the security key. Without it, we can't override the lockdown." Joe clenched his fists. They were so close. He wasn't about to let a key stand between them and stopping the tech from being activated. He turned to Bill and Emily, who were both standing guard, their eyes alert. "Do either of you have access to the key?" Bill shook his head. "We didn't plan for this. We thought we had more time." Emily, however, stepped forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Wait, I think I can help." Joe's gaze shot to her. "You know the key?" Emily nodded slowly, her fingers already tapping the side of the terminal, scanning it for any vulnerabilities. "I've done some work with systems like this before. I might be able to crack the code." Jonathan watched her, clearly skeptical. "You've got less than 5 minutes before they send in the reinforcements. Can you really do it?" Emily didn't hesitate. "I'll do it." Her fingers flew over the terminal's interface, tapping commands and codes at lightning speed. Joe's heart was in his throat as he watched her work. This was their only chance. If they didn't break the system now, they wouldn't have another shot. Time was running out. Then, just as the countdown neared 0, the screen blinked green. Override successful. The door to the vault released with a loud click, the hum of the machines ceasing. The room was silent for a moment. Then the doors to the vault slid open, revealing the massive tech within. "We're in," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to move quickly." As they stepped forward to disable the tech, the door behind them slammed open. A dozen armed mercenaries poured into the room, weapons raised. Joe's heart stopped. They had no time left. What do you think will happen next? Can Joe and his team fight off the mercenaries and stop the tech before it's too late? Share your theories below. The sound of boots pounding against the metal floor echoed through the vault, and Joe's body instinctively tensed. A dozen heavily armed mercenaries, their faces obscured by dark masks, filed into the room. They moved with terrifying precision, taking up positions around the perimeter, weapons trained on Joe and his team. Joe's pulse raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. His eyes flicked to Emily, Bill, and Jonathan. They were surrounded, and the tech they'd fought so hard to reach was mere steps away. "We don't have time for this," Joe said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "We have to disable the system. Now." One of the mercenaries, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. His voice was cold, calculating. "You should have stayed out of this, old man. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Joe's mind raced. The tech wasn't just a powerful tool. It was a weapon, and if the mercenaries got control of it, they could use it to reshape the world. The stakes were higher than ever. "We're not leaving without stopping you," Joe replied, his voice firm. The scarred mercenary smirked, signaling his men. "Then you're making a big mistake." Without warning, he raised his weapon. The air seemed to freeze, the sound of the gunshot ringing out like a thunderclap in the tight space of the vault. Joe ducked instinctively, feeling the heat of the bullet whizzing past his head. He pulled his own weapon, aiming at the mercenary. "Take cover," he shouted to his team. The vault erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed off the walls, each shot sending a sharp jolt through Joe's body. He moved quickly, ducking behind a nearby tech panel, narrowly avoiding another barrage of bullets. Emily and Bill were already in motion, scrambling for cover, but the mercenaries were closing in fast. Jonathan was at the terminal, furiously typing in commands, trying to disable the tech before it was too late. Sweat poured down his face as the seconds ticked by. "Get to him," Joe shouted. "We need to stop them before they activate the system." Emily moved first, sprinting across the room, her eyes focused on the terminal. Bill followed close behind, firing off shots to keep the mercenaries at bay. The air was thick with tension, every second feeling like a lifetime. Joe, still behind cover, risked a glance around the corner. The scarred mercenary was moving toward Jonathan, his weapon aimed directly at him. Joe's heart skipped a beat. If he didn't act now, they'd lose their only chance. With a roar, Joe surged forward, gun raised. The mercenary saw him coming, but it was too late. Joe fired, the bullet striking the mercenary's shoulder and sending him sprawling back. "Jonathan!" Joe yelled. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He turned, his fingers flying across the terminal. The screen flickered for a moment, then flashed. System disabled. The vault doors that had been holding them in place suddenly released with a loud clang, and the tech's lights dimmed, signaling that the system had been successfully shut down. "We did it," Emily said, breathless, her voice filled with relief. But their victory was short-lived. The remaining mercenaries weren't giving up that easily. They continued to advance, their weapons aimed at the team. The battle wasn't over yet. Bill fired off a few more shots, trying to keep the mercenaries at bay, but there were too many of them. Joe's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, searching for an escape route. "We need to get out of here," Joe said urgently. "Now." Jonathan nodded. "There's a side exit, through the lower levels. It's our only chance." But the mercenaries were closing in fast, their guns raised. Joe's mind raced. There was no time to waste. "Cover me," Joe shouted. He sprinted toward the exit, his heart hammering in his chest. The gunfire behind him was relentless, but he didn't dare look back. The only thing that mattered now was getting out alive, and making sure they didn't leave without stopping the mercenaries for good. The team followed close behind, with Emily and Bill providing cover fire. The mercenaries weren't far behind, their footsteps growing louder as they pursued. As they reached the exit, a deafening explosion shook the room. Joe's body was thrown forward, slamming against the metal door. The blast had come from one of the mercenaries' grenades, and the walls of the vault trembled with the force of the explosion. "Move," Jonathan shouted, pushing Joe forward. They stumbled through the door and into a narrow corridor, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of the explosion echoed behind them, signaling that the mercenaries were right on their tail. They ran as fast as they could, the passageway twisting and turning in a maze of metal. Joe's breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't slow down. They had to get out. If they didn't, everything they had worked for would be lost. Suddenly, the corridor ahead exploded into a blinding light, and Joe slammed into the wall as he tried to dodge the blast. His ears rang with the sound of gunfire, but it was different this time. It was distant, muffled. He glanced back to see Emily and Bill ducking behind a corner, guns drawn. "We can't keep running like this," Bill panted. "We need a plan." Joe nodded. "We fight. We fight until we win." Will Joe and his team manage to escape the mercenaries' pursuit and survive the final showdown? Or will their mission end in tragedy? What do you think will happen next? Share your thoughts below. The narrow corridor was a blur of motion as Joe and his team sprinted through the labyrinth of metal walls, the sound of gunfire and explosions growing more distant with every step. But their respite was short-lived. The mercenaries had them cornered. They could feel the weight of the walls closing in, the air thick with tension and the harsh scent of smoke still lingering from the explosion. Joe's heart pounded in his chest. They had come so far. So much was on the line. But the mercenaries weren't just going to let them walk out of this facility alive. "We need to set up a defensive position," Joe said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "Jonathan, is there a way to access the vault doors remotely? We need to lock them down before they get any closer." Jonathan was already at the terminal, his hands moving quickly across the interface. "It's not ideal," he muttered, "but if I can access the security override, I might be able to lock them out for a few minutes. That should give us time to regroup." Bill and Emily moved into position, weapons drawn and eyes alert. They could feel the pressure mounting, the sound of footsteps growing louder with each passing second. The mercenaries were closing in. "How long?" Joe asked, his eyes scanning the corridor, his finger resting on the trigger of his gun. "5 minutes, maybe," Jonathan replied, his voice strained. "If I'm lucky." Joe gave a sharp nod. "That'll have to do. Get to work, Jonathan." The air felt tense, every breath like a ticking clock. Joe's instincts told him that if they didn't stop the mercenaries now, they wouldn't make it out. Jonathan's fingers flew over the terminal, his eyes flicking between the screen and the advancing shadows. Come on," he muttered under his breath. Emily crouched low, scanning the hallway for any signs of movement. Her fingers tightened around the grip of her gun as she prepared for the inevitable. "They're coming. We won't have much time." Bill moved to her side, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. "We've got to hold them off, no matter what." A cold voice echoed down the hallway, sharp and unrelenting. "There's nowhere left to run. Surrender now, and maybe we'll show mercy." Joe's grip tightened on his gun as the voice of the mercenary leader reverberated off the metal walls. He had heard that voice before, cold, calculating, and full of malice. It was the same voice that had threatened them in the vault, the same voice that had almost gotten them killed. "We'll never surrender," Joe said, his voice low and resolute. "Not to you." The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the sharp beeping of Jonathan's terminal. "Got it," Jonathan exclaimed, relief flooding his voice. "I've locked the doors. They can't get through for now." The team exhaled as one, but they knew this wasn't over. It was just a temporary reprieve. Joe nodded. "All right, we make our stand here. Emily, Bill, take the left side. I'll cover the right. Jonathan, stay low and keep an eye on that terminal. We don't know how long we have before they breach." Without a word, they took their positions, weapons ready, eyes trained on the hallway ahead. The silence was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut through. Then, without warning, the metallic clang of the vault doors echoed through the facility as the mercenaries tried to breach. They could hear the sound of heavy tools being used to force their way through. Joe's grip on his gun tightened. He knew this was it. "They're coming," Bill whispered, his voice tight. "Get ready." A shadow appeared in the doorway, then another, and then a whole line of mercenaries poured into view, their weapons raised. They moved with deadly precision, their faces cold and emotionless. The odds were stacked against them, but Joe wasn't backing down. He raised his gun and fired, the shots ringing out in quick succession. One mercenary fell, then another. But there were too many of them, and their fire was relentless. Emily and Bill opened fire, covering Joe's flank. Their shots were precise, but the mercenaries were well trained. They moved with lethal intent, their weapons flashing in the dim light. Joe's mind was a blur of action. He ducked behind a nearby pillar, narrowly avoiding a bullet that whizzed past his head. The sound of gunfire filled the room, the air thick with the scent of smoke and gunpowder. Then, from the corner of his eye, Joe saw a mercenary charging toward Jonathan, who was still focused on the terminal. "No!" Joe shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. He dove forward, gun raised, and fired. The shot hit the mercenary in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Jonathan didn't miss a beat. "I'm almost there," he called out, his voice tight with focus. "Just a little longer." Joe's eyes darted around the room. They were running out of time. They had to hold the line, or they would be trapped. A mercenary dropped to his knees in front of him, but Joe didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger, sending the man crumpling to the floor. They were close. So close. The vault doors finally gave way with a deafening crash, and the mercenaries poured in, their faces masked by shadows. But Joe was ready. The team opened fire together, their shots coordinated in perfect harmony. Joe could feel his heartbeat in his chest, each shot ringing out like a thunderclap. Finally, the last of the mercenaries fell, their bodies strewn across the room. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood, and Joe stood over the wreckage, his chest heaving with exertion. His fingers trembled, but he didn't let them falter. "Jonathan," he called out, "is it done?" Jonathan slowly stood up from the terminal, sweat dripping down his face. His hands were shaking. "It's done," he said, a breath of relief escaping his lips. "The tech is disabled." Joe exhaled sharply. They had done it. Against all odds, they had stopped the mercenaries and prevented the tech from being activated. But the battle wasn't over. They had to get out. "Let's move," Joe said, his voice resolute. "We're not out of the woods yet." The team gathered their gear, knowing the escape would be just as dangerous as the battle they had fought. But for now, they had won. For now, they were safe. What do you think will happen next? Will Joe and his team make it out of the facility alive? How will they handle the aftermath of the battle? Share your thoughts below. Joe and his team moved quickly, their footsteps echoing through the dimly lit corridors. The hum of the facility's cooling systems and the distant clatter of debris from the earlier explosions were the only sounds accompanying them as they navigated the twisting passageways. The mission was almost complete, but the weight of their actions pressed heavily on Joe's shoulders. They had survived the mercenaries' assault, disabled the tech that could have changed the world in ways no one could predict, but the cost was starting to sink in. The facility was a war zone now, and they couldn't afford to linger. "Keep moving," Joe urged, his voice low but filled with determination. "We're almost there." Jonathan, who had been in the rear, scanned the walls as they moved. His face was pale, but his focus never wavered. "This way," he said, pointing to a narrow service exit at the end of the hall. "I've got the security codes for the lower levels. It should get us out." The path was littered with obstacles. Broken equipment, overturned furniture, and debris from the previous explosions blocked their way. Yet, the real danger was not the physical barriers but the uncertainty hanging in the air. The mercenaries weren't all dead. Some had likely retreated to regroup, and that meant they had no time to waste. Bill glanced back, his eyes hard. "We're running out of time. If we don't get to that exit soon, they'll regroup and we'll be stuck in here." "I know," Joe said, his voice tense. "Stay sharp." They reached the service exit, and Jonathan quickly typed in the security codes. The door hissed as it unlocked, revealing a long, narrow staircase leading down into a dark underground parking garage. It was their escape route, but it was hardly safe. "Are you sure this leads to the outside?" Emily asked, still wary of the unknown. Jonathan nodded. "Yeah, this will take us to the back of the facility. We'll have a clear shot to the road from there." The team filed into the stairwell, moving quickly but cautiously. With each step, Joe's thoughts turned inward. They had succeeded, but at what cost? The lives they had taken, the choices they had made. They couldn't escape the consequences, no matter how much they wished they could. As they descended the stairs, Joe's mind replayed the moments of the battle. The mercenaries were no ordinary foes. They were ruthless, well-funded, and well-equipped. Their leader had known what was at stake, And the fact that they had fought so hard for this tech told Joe just how dangerous it could be in the wrong hands. When they reached the garage, Joe's eyes flicked around the large, dimly lit space. He could hear the distant rumble of trucks and engines above ground, but they were safe, for now. They just needed to get out of the area and disappear. "Wait here," Joe said, his voice tight. "I'll go check the perimeter." He moved quickly to the far end of the garage, using every bit of training he had learned over the years. His every step was deliberate, cautious. His heart raced in his chest, not from fear, but from the realization of how close they had come to losing it all. The sound of a distant vehicle revving its engine made him pause. Joe's eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows. A van was pulling into the parking lot just outside the garage, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator on the hunt. He quickly ducked behind a concrete pillar, his pulse pounding. He motioned for the team to stay quiet and hide. The van's engine cut off, and a figure stepped out, silhouetted in the light from the headlights. It was one of the mercenaries. Joe's grip on his weapon tightened. He couldn't let them be caught now, not after everything they had been through. His mind raced as he calculated their next move. The mercenary walked toward the entrance, his movements slow and deliberate. He was clearly checking the area, likely for signs of the team. Joe didn't know how many more mercenaries were out there, but he couldn't afford to wait for them to find them first. "On my mark," Joe whispered to the team. Emily, Bill, and Jonathan were crouched low, weapons at the ready. They understood without a word. Their survival depended on their ability to act quickly and decisively. The mercenary paused just outside the garage, looking around cautiously. He was alone for now, but that wouldn't last long. Joe didn't hesitate. "Now!" In a flash, Joe sprinted toward the mercenary, his gun raised. Emily and Bill followed, their footsteps synchronized in perfect rhythm as they flanked the enemy. Jonathan stayed low, covering their backs. The mercenary barely had time to react before Joe closed the distance. He swung his weapon at the man, knocking him off balance and sending him to the ground with a crash. The struggle was brief but intense. Joe pressed his advantage, quickly disarming the mercenary and holding him at gunpoint. "Where are the others?" Joe demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The mercenary struggled, but Joe's grip was unyielding. "I'm not telling you anything." Joe's eyes narrowed. "You will. You're either going to talk, or you're going to regret it." A tense silence hung in the air, the only sound the heavy breathing of the mercenary beneath Joe's foot. Finally, the man's defiance cracked. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, but the anger in his voice was mixed with a tinge of fear. "The boss will come for you. You won't make it out alive." Joe's expression hardened. "We'll see about that." Before he could press further, a sudden noise interrupted them. A low, rumbling sound from above. The team froze. "That's not good," Bill muttered. "They're bringing in reinforcements." Joe looked at his team. They couldn't afford to be caught now. They had to leave, and fast. "Jonathan, you know where the nearest exit is?" Joe asked, his voice urgent. Jonathan nodded. "There's a fire exit on the north side of the building. It leads to an alley. We can slip out of there." "Good. Let's move." They didn't waste another second. Joe and his team moved quickly, hauling the mercenary to his feet and forcing him toward the exit. The garage door slowly rolled up, revealing the alley beyond. The noise from the approaching vehicles grew louder, but they had just enough time to make their escape. They ran into the alley, the cool night air hitting their faces as they finally emerged into the open. For the first time in hours, Joe allowed himself to breathe, but only for a moment. "We're not out of this yet," Emily said, looking over her shoulder. "They'll be looking for us." "We'll lay low," Joe replied. "But we've done what we came here to do. Now we need to get off the grid." As they disappeared into the shadows, the distant rumble of the approaching mercenaries' vehicles faded behind them. They had survived, but they knew that the war was far from over. What do you think will happen now? Will Joe and his team make it to safety, or will the mercenaries track them down? What's next for them after everything they've been through? Share your thoughts below.